Hey there, and welcome to Planet Echoes. If Earth is only a training ground, who writes the lessons, and why do they cut so cleanly? At dusk, on a high plateau, the wind sounded like pages turning as shadows slid over a ring of low stones. They weren't graves or ruins, just pale marks like chalk after rain. The ground felt taut, as if built to catch a fall and make you stand again. I came because the stories wouldn't leave me alone. In distant villages, elders answered my question about life the same way: practice. One called Earth a loom that expects our hands, another a courtyard where steps must match the heart. An astronomer with gentle eyes tapped his chest and said, "We're migrants. Homesick for a place we can't name, so we rehearse." What shook me wasn't belief, but pattern. Across oceans, metaphors rhymed. Drills, trials, initiations, gates. Old hero tales never end in triumph. They open a deeper test. The world seemed shaped to shape us, like a shoe that forces a blister to harden into callus. Beside a fossil lake bed, I counted hexagonal tiles in the drying mud and felt kinship with bees. What kind of planet puts geometry into puddles? What lesson echoes from basalt columns to a fern's coil, from ribcage to tide? The wind smelled like iron and carried back a first failure, a childhood lie told to protect a friend, and the slow mercy of confession. That was the day I learned hiding delays the lesson but never cancels it. If this place is a curriculum, pain isn't punishment. It's instruction in a language we refuse to translate. I followed the old shoreline and found fish bones turned to stone, so thin I dared not touch them. A mentor once told me the hardest class is the one you grade yourself. I felt that here, mirrors everywhere, lake mirroring sky, cloud mirroring ridge, my doubt mirroring wind that broke itself against the escarpment until it knew the contour by heart. Some landscapes confess their purposes, others keep their mouths shut. The silence here was active, like a held breath. Ravens argued overhead in a language older than our maps. In the grass, a lizard clicked like a metronome. Who set the tempo? Maybe weather's cruelty, season's stubbornness, time's blind hunger. All of it is a syllabus written in elements. Maybe storms are reading assignments. Maybe Thor is a seminar in letting go. It would be easy to call this wishful thinking, sanding randomness until it fits the palm. But another unease tugged at me. The fit seemed to come first. Our bodies slot too well into this place. Our lives trace decay and renewal too closely, as if the course were tailored to our weaknesses. The ordeals have teeth shaped for us. Does a maze love the mouse because it feeds him, or because failure makes him learn the walls? A bank of clouds swallowed the sun. In the dim light, the stone grooves stood out. Not letters, not pictures, only the pressure an apprentice leaves while steadying a hand. I thought of our species' apprenticeships: fire, language, grief, law. Each mastery opens a door onto a harder hallway. Each era graduates into a challenge it couldn't imagine while studying the last. That night, I dreamt of a classroom without walls, aurora for a ceiling and a river for a floor, where answers erased the questions as they passed. I woke tasting water, and knowing the questions were the point. The grade would not be a number, but a direction. To the east, a pale ridge etched itself into a valley I'd never seen on any map. Elders had spoken of a place that appears only when you're ready to notice. I was tired of being blind. If Earth is a training ground, there must be a door, and doors rarely stand in open fields. They hide at thresholds. And to find out, I took my first step toward the valley that shouldn't exist. The sentence echoed in my mind as if I had borrowed it, as though it belonged not to me, but to something watching. The valley was still wrapped in twilight, its contours blurred, but each step downhill seemed rehearsed, familiar, as if I had walked it before. The grass grew shorter, thinner, until it gave way to bare ground, streaked with white like chalk lines on a board. I thought of the elders again, their strange smiles when they spoke of hidden places. Had they already walked here? Or was this valley not even fixed, but a classroom summoned only when a student arrived? The air grew warmer as the slope descended, though no fire burned. I bent to touch the soil. It was too fine, almost sifted, without stone or root. Not natural. I remembered a line in an old manuscript from Mesopotamia. The gods smoothed the floor so the children would not stumble before their eyes. Was this what it meant? The place felt staged. I knelt to listen. Sound carried differently here. My breath lingered too long, and the crunch of my boots dissolved faster than it should have. Echoes that didn't belong to me came from the ridge, half murmurs like a class repeating after a teacher. My skin tightened. If Earth is only a training ground, perhaps this valley was one of its testing halls. At the centre I found no monument, no temple, only emptiness wide enough to make me dizzy. The wind dropped as if silenced by command. Then I noticed shallow depressions in the soil, not footprints, not animal tracks, but impressions shaped like circles, intersecting, repeating in a pattern I'd seen before in an old codex kept under glass in a desert museum. Those sketches had been dismissed as ornament, but standing here I realised they were diagrams of this very ground. A sharp thought pierced me. What if we are graded collectively, not as individuals? Civilizations could rise and vanish not because of drought or war, but because they failed the lesson. Atlantis, the Indus Valley, Cahokia, all brilliant, all gone. What if their disappearance wasn't catastrophe but expulsion? What if Earth erases those who cannot advance? My chest tightened at the cruelty of it. Yet a colder idea followed. Cruelty might be the wrong word. To us it feels merciless, but to those who set the curriculum it may simply be procedure. A teacher does not weep when a student fails, though the student's tears are real. Were we tears on the cheek of the planet? I sat on the chalky floor until night fully fell. The stars overhead looked uncannily bright, as though seen through a thinner veil. I remembered an astronomer's phrase, "In certain places the sky seems closer because Earth remembers less there." That thought unsettled me. Could memory itself be part of this training? Civilizations build archives, then lose them, then build again. Forgetting might be the most reliable lesson of all. A pale glow stirred at the valley's far edge. At first I thought it moonlight slipping between clouds, but the moon was still low. The glow pulsed, faint but deliberate, like a hand tapping a desk to call for attention. Every nerve screamed at me to leave, yet another voice inside insisted, "This is the next page. To stop now would mean closing the book before the words are read." I stood, legs trembling, and walked toward the glow. The closer I came, the clearer its outline grew, a thin seam in the air, as though someone had split the night itself with a blade. No sound, no smell, only a hush deeper than silence. I reached out and the seam rippled, not cold, not hot, but charged with the texture of thought itself, like touching memory before it hardens. In that moment I understood why so many myths spoke of gates that opened only for those ready. This was no valley floor, it was a threshold. If Earth is a training ground, then this was one of its exam doors, waiting to see who dared to step through. And though my fear rose like tide water, my hand did not fall away. The seam widened, shadows bent inward. My next step would carry me beyond the ground I knew. I inhaled once, steady, and whispered to myself the only truth I had. Nothing worth learning comes without crossing a threshold. Then I moved forward into the seam, into whatever waited beyond the valley that shouldn't exist. The first sensation was not light, but pressure, like entering deep water where sound goes shy and time drifts to the edge of the room. I didn't fall, didn't rise, I slid. A faint luminescence gathered without a source, chalk pale and steady, as if the darkness itself had learned to glow. When the pressure eased, I stood on what looked like the same valley floor, yet it wasn't the valley. It was its outline, its memory, a place that had been cleaned of the world. No smell of dust, no insect clicks. The ground was a single continuous surface, fine as sifted flour, unbroken by root or pebble. I crouched and pinched some between my fingers. It didn't cling, didn't stain. It felt like the idea of soil, not soil itself. A soft twist curled through my mind. It wasn't just artifacts that were gone here. It was the soil itself. What kind of room removes the medium of life but keeps the shape of the land? At the far side, structures revealed themselves not as walls but as deepened shadows, edges where the glow refused to cross. I approached the nearest and found a recess with a seat carved from the same seamless substance. It fit my height too well, as if measured in absentia. I sat and found my breath settling into a rhythm the room seemed to approve of, like a tutor tapping a metronome until you match the beat. Was this place built to pace us? Did the ground keep time the way a teacher keeps silence? A murmur rose, not from speakers or wind, but from the shape of the space. It was speech without words, the cadence of instruction. I recognised nothing and yet felt corrected. Images did not appear so much as lean in. A child sharing water with another child under a red sky. A woman untying a knot 3 centuries ago. A farmer choosing to leave a field fallow though hunger pressed his ribs. A sailor lowering a sail before the wind tore it. Tiny choices, the quiet curriculum. If Earth is a training ground, the lessons weren't grand miracles. They were pivots, moments where mercy outweighed impulse, where restraint proved more difficult than conquest. I stood and the images faded. Beneath my boots, shallow circles once again emerged, those intersecting patterns I'd seen outside, but here they were crisp, deliberate, cut as if by light. I followed them to a central apron where the circles converged into spirals, then into lines that almost suggested script. My pulse quickened. This was close to language without offering the mercy of reading. I turned to leave some distance to blunt my anticipation and realised the door seam had vanished. No fear, not quite. More the alertness of a student called to the front of the room. I spoke aloud, testing the space. My voice came back a heartbeat early, as if the echo answered before the call. The lag reversed. My stomach tightened. If time was elastic here, it bent in favour of response. What does it teach a species to hear its echoes first? Perhaps it prepares us to consider consequences before we act, to feel the aftertaste ahead of the bite. At the recess's base, I noticed grooves worn by hands, left and right, countless times resting, lifting, resting again. Not mine, not recent. The prints had a universal shape, human, but without signature. We had been here before, or those like us had. I pressed my palms to the grooves and heat woke under the surface, soft as breath against glass. A flute of light rose from the floor, an upright line that branched into 3, like a signpost with options. The murmur tightened into a pattern I could almost hum. 3 paths, 3 temperaments, 3 trials. I thought of civilizations leaning toward their favourite virtues and dying by them. Brilliance without patience, power without tenderness, order without wonder. I chose the centre branch. The glow pooled wider, resolving into panels arranged like the pages of a book laid open on the ground. On each, a scene from human life. A market argument ending in laughter instead of blood. A burial where the living returned to plant trees above the dead. A courtroom where the judge left the bench to sit beside a trembling boy. Not myth, not legend, ordinary salvation, the kind that alters the slope of history 1 degree. The panels did not judge, but attention itself felt like a measure. The room was asking whether we saw these as victories. A low tone sounded, not reprimand, not praise. It held the neutrality of a ruler ticking along wood. measurement. Perhaps the curriculum isn't pass-fail. Perhaps it calibrates us. A teacher once told me that calibration is kinder than correction because it assumes capacity. The thought steadied me. If we are meant to grow, the exam isn't to shame us. It's to reveal our readiness for the next hard good. When the panels dimmed, the central apron brightened again. The lines I had mistaken for mere geometry thickened, looped, and tilted until something like writing hovered at the edge of comprehension. I felt the tug of a word, not in any tongue I'd studied, not in any script I knew. It trembled at the back of my throat like a name from a half-remembered dream. On the central slab, a spiral of unfamiliar marks waited for me to remember a word I'd never learned. The marks pulsed faintly, as though aware of my hesitation, and each pulse seemed to echo in my chest. I leaned closer, tracing their curves with my eyes, and found myself whispering sounds that were not mine. They rose unbidden, like remembering the rhythm of a lullaby from a forgotten childhood. At first the sounds felt meaningless, yet the longer I allowed them to shape my breath, the clearer one of them became. A syllable I could not translate, but understood with a certainty beyond reason. The carvings matched no known language, yet I understood one word. It struck me like a hammer, and yet comforted me like a hand on the shoulder. The word meant continue. It was not command, not plea, but permission. My throat tightened. What kind of tongue tells you to go on without defining where? The chamber answered with a slow hum. The spiral shifted, unfolding into arcs that formed a pattern too deliberate to be random. They resembled constellations, but not the ones above Earth. Each line connected stars I had never seen. The lesson was plain. We were not meant to stay here forever. This valley, this world, was a classroom, and beyond it lay a sky of destinations. But who had written the homework? Who graded the stars? A tremor ran through the ground, not violent, but enough to make the panels scatter like pages caught by a draught. The hum grew sharper, pressing behind my ears. My mind filled with images, ancient temples built to align with solstices, stones arranged to mimic heavens, songs that told of return journeys, different cultures, distant in land, and time, all repeating the same unbroken instruction. Do not mistake the classroom for the home. I thought of pyramids in Egypt and Mexico, angled to pierce the night, of stone circles in Britain where sun and shadow braided their lesson across centuries, of the strange spirals carved into Irish rock, enduring rain as though they longed for a student who would finally pronounce them. The shock was not their existence, but their sameness. Cultures with no contact had drawn the same signs, as though remembering fragments of a syllabus scattered across continents. My hands trembled as I reached toward the spirals again. This time the carvings burned cool blue, and a flicker of sound broke into something sharper, almost words. It wasn't English or Sumerian or Mayan, but my body understood it. The message was cruelly simple: you are late. The words hollowed me. Late for what? For the next lesson? For departure? Had other civilizations advanced while we still stumbled? Was Atlantis erased not by flood, but by failure to arrive on time? Did the Indus Valley fall silent because its pupils dropped the pen before the exam ended? My stomach churned. If this was a school, then history itself was a record of students who abandoned their desks. The hum softened, as if satisfied that I had grasped some fraction of the lesson. The panels dimmed again, retreating into the soil until only the central spiral glowed faintly. But the word continue still pressed at the back of my tongue, demanding motion, refusing rest. I turned in a slow circle. The seam I had entered through remained closed, a wall of sealed dark. The only direction was forward, toward an opening that had not been there before. It yawned at the far end of the chamber, a narrow passage lined with faint light, like a corridor cut through dusk itself. My pulse raced as I stepped toward it. The silence was deep, yet not empty. It felt like walking into the hollow of an enormous heart, its beat too slow for human ears. The floor shifted from fine powder to something firmer, smoother, almost polished. At the end of the corridor stood a second chamber. Unlike the first, this one was filled with pillars carved in that same alien script, each one facing inward, like judges encircling a trial. I could feel their presence, not hostile, not kind, simply measuring. My footsteps echoed too loudly, and I wondered if they were grading sound, posture, hesitation. The carving stirred faintly as I entered. Again the syllables tugged at my throat. This time the meaning was not a word but a question. It asked nothing about my name, nothing about my origin. It asked only this: what have you learned? I froze. What answer could I give? That humanity had mastered fire and weapon, wheel and scripture, grief and mercy. That we learned slower than we destroyed, but we learned none the less. My voice shook as I whispered the truth I could bear. We are still learning. The pillars glowed, brighter than before, and their humming question quieted. They accepted the answer, or perhaps they postponed the verdict. Either way, the corridor behind me closed, and I knew the next threshold waited beyond the far wall, where a faint shimmer like liquid air beckoned me forward. I stood in the hush, palms still tingling from the pillar's heat, and felt the old reflex of doubt look for footing. In the world I had left, stones obeyed weather and time, language travelled along family trees, memory belonged to skull and culture. Here, the rules felt present but amended, as if a teacher had written corrections in the margins of reality. I reached for the shimmer and watched it quiver like breath on winter glass. When my fingers touched, the surface yielded with a tenderness that startled me, the way a hand sometimes meets your hand in the dark hallway of grief. I stepped through, and the room changed scale. Above me the ceiling widened into a pale dome, not stone, not sky, but something that let light gather without a source. Across it unfurled a moving fresco. Coastlines grew and sank, forests marched and retreated, ice braided the world and unbraided. Geological time usually requires years of study or the patience of a mountain. Here it hung in the air like a lesson plan. Science had taught me to see strata as pages, to read uplift and erosion like sentences. This dome did the same but with intent, curating epochs the way a careful mentor decides which exercises to assign a tired student. It was the same Earth and not the same Earth, not accident, curriculum. Then the fresco narrowed to human time. Cities lit the darkness and winked out. Trade routes pulsed like capillaries. Borders flexed and forgot themselves. I watched towers tilt into flood and plain walls endure 10 emperors. The dome paused on a handful of moments that bent my throat. A mother lifting a child onto her shoulders so he could see over a wall of soldiers. A scribe adding a small forbidden line to a law so that mercy could breathe. A shepherd putting down a stone he had meant to throw. Choice after choice, quiet as moths, bright as flares. I felt measured by them. A low tone vibrated through the floor, a sound that made memory twitch. The fresco faded and left only a single mark at its centre. That same spiral, but now overlaid on a map that wasn't quite world, wasn't quite star. It looked like someone had drawn paths between lessons, as if compassion led naturally to restraint, restraint to truth, truth to courage, and courage to what? The line ran off the edge of the map as if pointing out of curriculum toward a door labelled with the word that had lodged behind my tongue: continue. I thought of all the places on earth where stone meets sky with impossible precision, doorways aligned to equinox, windows that catch a single star once a year. We had called them calendars, shrines, status. What if they were attendance sheets? The scientist in me kicked against the wall. Alignments can be coincidence. Human minds are nets engineered to catch patterns, but the net itself is a fact, and in this dome the pattern kept presenting itself without apology. The lesson did not ask to be believed, it asked to be learned. The floor warmed subtly, drawing me toward a platform with 3 niches carved waist-high. In each, a small depression shaped for water, grain, and ash. My mouth went dry. The trio lives in ritual across continents, offering, sustenance, remembrance. I poured nothing. I had nothing, and the dome still responded as if honouring the gesture hidden in my hesitation. Across the ceiling, abacus beads of light slid along invisible wires and stopped over the niche shaped for ash. A sentence arranged itself inside me without passing through words. What you burn teaches what you fear losing. The thought made my knees weak. We have spent ages burning each other, burning forests, burning time. What curriculum balances what is lost against what is learned? A new panel unfolded at the edge of the room, not fresco, not map, mirror. It showed me, but not my posture or face. It showed the pattern of choices I had made so far in this place. Fear greeted, curiosity fed, arrogance starved. I looked smaller than I expected and felt more held than I deserved. If there were graders here, they graded with context, not cruelty. For the first time, a heat rose behind my eyes that wasn't terror. If a classroom can care, this one did, and yet it would not lower the standard. Something shifted behind the mirror. Not image, a figure. Height like mine, hands folded, head tilted as if trying to catch a difficult note. The figure stepped closer and the dome brightened so fast my breath caught. We stood inches apart with only a film of light between us. It wasn't my reflection. The face was mine and not mine, older and younger, grief smoothed and wonder creased, the way a face looks when it has worn 2 lives at once. When it spoke, the voice arrived a heartbeat before the lips moved, like those echoes in the first chamber. "Continue," it said gently, giving me back the word I'd been given. I wanted to answer, to ask who had stood at this mirror before me, whether the rooms bloom everywhere or only here, whether our species is late or right on time. But the figure's eyes shifted past me, toward the door I had not yet noticed, a narrow slice of dark that felt like the deep end of a pool you're not sure you can cross. The mirror dimmed until only the outline of the door remained, and I felt the measure settle again, impartial and patient. I didn't know if stepping through meant leaving this world, or only leaving another layer of my unpreparedness behind, but I knew this much. The lessons we refuse wait for us in the next room. I placed my palm on the cool seam and leaned forward into the dark, just as the figure on the other side leaned too, and the door thinned to the thickness of a breath. And then the shimmer spoke my name. The sound of it was not sound at all, but resonance, as if the chamber had reached inside me and plucked a string wound through my spine. I staggered, gripping the doorway, because what I heard was not merely recognition, it was memory calling itself aloud. I had not given my name here, had not written it, whispered it, carved it. Yet the room carried it as though it had been stored long before my arrival, kept safe like a password waiting for my lips to match. The figure that mirrored me a moment ago dissolved into the shimmer, but the voice remained, repeating my name in tones that shifted, first with my own inflection, then in the voice of my mother, then of strangers I hadn't heard in years. Each variation carried a weight, a reminder of every stage of life when someone had summoned me, and each time I had answered, chosen, or refused. It was not identity being tested, but continuity. Did I remember who I had been through the 1,000 masks of living? I pressed through the seam, and the next chamber was nothing like the last. It was not a room, but a corridor without end, lined on both sides with doors. Each door pulsed faintly, each carried a symbol scratched above its frame, some geometric, some organic, some I recognised from ancient sites I had studied, others impossibly alien. My heart thundered. What kind of test requires endless doors? Were these classrooms, prisons, archives? I reach for the nearest, one marked with a spiral almost identical to carvings at Newgrange in Ireland. When I touched it, the door dissolved and revealed a scene inside. Not stone, not light, but memory. I saw a tribe gathered around fire thousands of years ago. A child reached into the flames by accident and screamed. Instinct pushed one of the elders to plunge his hand into the fire, lifting the child out and carrying the burn himself. The tribe fell silent. The choice branded them, not only in skin but in culture. Mercy entered their vocabulary that night. The door closed, sealing the lesson back into itself. Every door was like that, a preserved moment of human choice. I moved from one to another, glimpsing them without stepping inside. A battlefield where a soldier dropped his spear to lift a wounded enemy. A famine where strangers shared roots and bark rather than hoard. A trial where a woman confessed guilt that would spare another's life. Over and over, the chambers repeated the same thesis. The exam of humanity is written not in victories or empires, but in the small pivots where compassion triumphs over fear. And yet not all doors glowed warmly. Some flickered with harsher tones, darker hues. Against caution, I pressed one, and the chamber showed me a burning library, its pages falling as embers into an indifferent sky. Another showed conquest painted in red, cities levelled not by nature but by human hand. These were failures, or perhaps remedial lessons, warnings etched into the curriculum. My throat burned with shame as I saw the patterns we still repeated in my own lifetime. If this was a training ground, then humanity had been caught copying the same mistakes on every exam sheet. I stepped back, trembling. Behind me the corridor extended without horizon, doors stretching forever, each one a record of our passage. How many exams had we sat for? How many times had we been given a chance to continue? I thought of lost civilizations whose ruins we gawk at like broken toys. What if they weren't destroyed by mystery or catastrophe but by dismissal? Expelled for failing their lesson? A soft pulse drew me to a door brighter than the rest, its symbol a triangle interlaced with circles. It reminded me of diagrams in Mayan codices, symbols I had once dismissed as astronomical speculation. With dread and wonder I reached forward. The door yielded, and the chamber inside was not history but possibility. I saw Earth, my Earth, now. Cities crawling with neon veins, forests retreating, oceans acid-shocked. And I saw faces, billions of them, glancing up as if waiting for instruction. The chamber whispered, not in words but in presence. This exam is still in progress. I fell to my knees. For the first time the lessons were not distant stories or carved spirals. They were here, now, my breath inside the question. The corridor darkened, leaving only the bright door ahead. I wiped my face, ashamed and electrified, and knew the path was narrowing to force the choice. Humanity wasn't just being remembered in this place. It was being graded as we spoke. Every kindness and cruelty marked like ink that cannot fade. The doors behind me sealed with a final click. Ahead the corridor curved out of sight, carrying the bright triangle forward. I rose and followed, because the chamber's voice still pulsed my name, urging me not merely to watch, but to answer. And I understood, with cold clarity, that I had entered not just the record of lessons, but the threshold of the exam itself. The corridor tightened as I moved forward, no longer infinite but funneled, walls pressing inward like a throat preparing to swallow. The symbols above the doors grew sharper, not etched, but alive, adjusting as if to read me rather than be read. My pulse tapped time against my ribs. The floor tapped back, sinking, a metronome set by something that knew the rhythm I pretended not to keep. Who chooses the tempo of our courage? We or the rooms that demand it? The bright triangle ahead widened into a chamber of sand sunk like a bowl. No seats, no dais, no judge. Only 3 objects on pedestals equidistant around the rim. A blade, a bowl, and a bell. Each was plain to the edge of beauty, stripped of ornament, alive with the honesty of tools that have endured many hands. A dry wind moved with no source, raising the faintest hush from the sand like pages whispering as they turn themselves. If Earth is a training ground, maybe the exams never ask, what do you believe? But what will you do? I went to the bell first because it felt least dangerous. Bronze, hand-sized, with a worn handle where fingers had built a home. I lifted it and felt weight that exceeded metal, the way a word can weigh more than the mouth that forms it. When I rang it, the note slid across the bowl and climbed the walls, and doors opened. Not the symbol doors of memory, but 3 plain entrances yawning black, and inside each I sensed people, strangers. The note wasn't a sound, it was a summons. My throat tightened. Who do you become when you ask for help? Does the act lessen you, or expand the circle that can hold what you cannot? Footsteps approached, then halted at the threshold as if the unseen were measuring me in return. The bell's note faded. I set it down, hands shaking, and went to the bowl. Earth-coloured clay, cool to the touch, shallow and wide. On the pedestal beside it, a thin thread of water sprang from the air and filled the bowl to the lip without spilling, as if gravity obeyed a kinder law here. Across the sand a line of coals woke to orange, not flame, just glow, the way anger lives low until breath feeds it. The room laid out a simple test. Carry this water through that heat without losing what keeps life alive. How many of our histories failed this because the bearers were alone? How many passed because someone walked beside them, shading the water with an unasked-for hand? I tried alone first. The heat lifted and pressed, a soft tyrant. Halfway across, the bowl sweated. 3 drops broke and died in the coals. The room did not scold, it remembered. I went back, rang the bell once, and 2 soft presences stepped from the dark and took place at my shoulders. No faces, no names, only steadiness, a shade against the heat. Together we crossed, and the bowl did not weep. The coals dimmed as if full. I breathed out a laugh too close to a sob. Perhaps the exam is not to prove heroism, but to accept interdependence as a science. What lesson takes longer for a species than admitting we need one another? The blade remained iron, dark, unadorned, trimmed to a purpose so honest it frightened me. I lifted it and felt not aggression but clarity, the way a surgeon's scalpel tells the hand, do no harm by doing what looks like harm. A rope hung in the chamber's centre, taut from ceiling to sand. Bound within its loops, a small shape struggled. Not animal, not human, more like a bundle of glowing threads trembling against their knots. A hum rose in my bones. The room did not say cut. The room did not say spare. It asked the oldest question. When is severing mercy? And when is it violence? I circled the rope, blade low. The glow inside dimmed when I came too close, brightened when I stepped back, as if my intention leaked from my skin. I remembered a village that had split along a fault line of insult. The clean cut of boundaries saved them more than forced unity ever could. I remembered, too, a friendship I had ended by mistaking discomfort for danger. The rope creaked, a whisper. Could wisdom be the art of cutting the knot without cutting the thread? I knelt, listening the way you listen at a door you fear to open. The glow pulsed faster, not panic, not plea, readiness. I slid the blade under a single loop, feeling the rope's fibre give like breath. One careful draw, and the knot loosened. The threads spilled free, arranging themselves in the air like a constellation learning its own name. They drifted to the bowl, touched the water, and the surface sang, a clear line that made the dark doors stir. somewhere far behind the walls, I felt the corridor of memory answer with a shiver. The blade cooled in my hand. Work done. The bell trembled without touch, as if grateful. The bowl held steady, no drop lost. The sand settled. A seam opened at the chamber's far rim, not bright this time, but blue, the colour of minutes right before dawn when the world studies its own outline. I stood with the 3 tools at my back and the seam before me, steady in a way that had nothing to do with bravery. The exam was not about passing. It was about becoming someone who could sit with the next question without lying. That realisation clung to me as I stepped through the seam into a place that did not look like a chamber at all. It resembled an open plain under a pale sky, though I knew I was still inside the architecture of the training ground. The horizon stretched forever, flat and muted, as if it were painted with ash and mist. Yet as I walked forward, I noticed the ground beneath me was not soil, not stone, but a tapestry, woven threads dark and light, crossing and recrossing in intricate knots. Each step pressed faintly into the weave, and when I lifted my foot, the threads shifted to repair themselves. I bent low and saw patterns in the tapestry, scenes of human lives stitched in miniature. One thread depicted a hunter lowering his spear before a doe, another showed 2 children sharing a crust of bread, but beside them ran darker knots, cruelty, betrayal, rage. The weave contained all of it, without favour, without shame. My chest tightened as I realised my steps were disturbing the pattern. Where I walked, threads bent, rearranged, rewove, and my passage became part of the tapestry itself. A voice, not outside but inside my chest, is whispered, "You are not only being taught, you are teaching the ground you walk upon." The thought unnerved me more than any blade or bell. What if the Earth's lessons are not only for us but also from us, each action and embroidery in the floor of the next generation's test? We're not students alone. We're also instructors, whether we wish it or not. The horizon trembled and the tapestry rippled like water disturbed. From that ripple rose figures, not mirrors this time, but people of every age and culture I had studied. An Egyptian scribe with ink-stained fingers, a Mayan astronomer, a cloaked druid, a monk with parchment, a woman with fire-touched eyes who could have been from any century. They surrounded me silently, each gazing down at the threads, not at me. I followed their eyes and saw that where I had stepped, a brighter thread now shimmered, delicate but alive, as if the ground itself acknowledged that a choice had been made and preserved. I wanted to ask them if they were real, if they were ghosts or students who had walked this path before me. But they never raised their eyes. They were not judges, they were reminders. Perhaps they were the ghosts of lessons humanity had once learned, present only to prove we were not alone in this syllabus of becoming. I walked farther, and the tapestry grew more complex. Now I saw entire civilizations woven into it, cities rising, collapsing, weaving themselves back into the pattern. Each time the threads shifted not into ruin, but into rearrangement, as though failure was not erasure but revision. The thought struck me. Maybe extinction itself is a classroom. Maybe vanished cultures weren't destroyed for nothing. Maybe they contributed threads that strengthened the weave for those who followed. A gust of wind carried the scent of smoke. Ahead, a section of tapestry burned, threads curling and blackening as if someone had set history aflame. I sprinted forward, panic lacing my chest, but no water, no hand could stop it. The fire consumed knots of compassion, alongside knots of cruelty, blind to value. I dropped to my knees, heart-breaking, until I saw something unexpected. Beneath the ashes, finer threads appeared, shining silver, too subtle to notice until the fire cleared the way. My breath caught. Even destruction was a teacher. Loss did not erase the lesson. It unveiled another layer of it. but the revelation came with a chill. If Earth is a training ground, maybe death, collapse, ruin, all are deliberate exams, necessary thresholds. Could it be that every grief we endure is not punishment, but prerequisite? If so, then what kind of final exam waits at the end of such preparation? My skin prickled as though the air itself had leaned in to hear my answer. The plain darkened as if a hand had lowered a veil. The figures dissolved back into the tapestry, leaving only the echo of their presence. Far ahead, the horizon folded into an archway of threads woven into a doorway. Beyond it glimmered a darkness so rich it seemed full rather than empty, like fertile soil before a seed touches it. My heart raced. This was no longer a corridor of reminders, but a true passage, a point of no return. I stood at the arch, fingers grazing the woven edges. The tapestry pulsed faintly beneath my hand, alive with the weight of every step, every act that had ever been. My name pulsed back at me from the weave, reminding me that no choice is forgotten, not even here. With trembling breath, I stepped toward the dark glimmer, aware that whatever lay beyond would no longer show me lessons past, but would ask me to bear a question humanity has avoided since its first fire. And as the arch folded around me, the ground itself whispered, "What do you fear to learn?" The question did not arrive in words, but in marrow, as if my bones had been asked to confess their oldest tremor. The woven arch sealed behind me without sound, and the dark beyond was not empty. It was listening. My breath fogged in air that should not have been cold. Tiny glints, like dust with intentions, drifted up from the unseen floor and arranged themselves into faint constellations around my knees. I lifted a hand and the dust pivoted, attentive as birds at a whistle. What lesson studies the student while pretending to be the room? A glow grew underfoot, revealing a circle of pale stone wide enough to contain a small town square. Beyond its edge, the dark thickened to velvet, swallowing everything but the circle and me. At cardinal points on the ring, 4 low plinths surfaced, each bearing a simple object. A seed, sealed in resin, a shard of black glass, a folded scrap of cloth, and a small hourglass whose sand hung mid-fall, arrested like breath before a sob. My throat tightened. Each object felt like a question disguised as a noun. If Earth is a training ground, was I about to choose my syllabus, or my sentence? I went to the seed first. It was the colour of dried blood, veined like a leaf, suspended in its clear prison. A thin crack ran through the resin, as if time itself had tried to set the thing free. When I touched it, warmth licked my palm and a field rose around me. Soil, rain, hands. I watched a farmer kneel after drought and press a single seed into cracked earth, humming to it as if a child could hear through shell. The vision tightened around one small decision. The farmer saved the last seed for planting instead of eating it, a life risked on a future unseen. The field fell away. The resin cooled. How many of our extinctions begin when we eat our seeds? The shard of black glass looked like a broken night. It held no reflection, only a depth that threatened to drink my face entire. I lifted it and flinched at the images that flashed within. A city lit with 1,000 small screens of distraction. A council chamber where laughter scabbed over truth. A soldier wiping his blade clean on his own sleeve. Then another image, softer. 2 rivals kneeling side by side to bind a stranger's wound. The shard burned when cruelty prevailed, cooled when mercy walked in. Was the lesson really this simple, or was I being softened for a harder edge ahead? Who benefits if we mistake sentiment for courage, or severity for wisdom? The scrap of cloth was impossible to date, woven coarse, frayed fine at the edges, smelling of rain. When I pressed it to my cheek, it wept other people's tears. I saw migrations, the long salt of exile, The relief of a door opening in a city where the language is not yours. My chest ached with borrowed grief. The cloth returned to the plinth on its own, as if unwilling to be comfort for only one pair of hands. What teacher leaves no signature but stitches a lesson into everything that touches skin? The hourglass remained. The sand inside it hung in a narrow throat of glass, each grain halted mid-descent like a held apology. I set my fingertip against the bulb and the grains trembled but did not fall. Time here was not paused, it was waiting to be chosen. My mouth went dry. We think time is a river. What if, in the classroom, time is a contract we keep breaking? What do we owe the hours we live in, and what do they owe us? Around the circle's rim, glyphs stirred. The not language I had met before, spiralling, almost legible. A single syllable braided up from the stone and touched the back of my tongue. The same word that had greeted me in the first chamber. Continue. But this time the word divided, as a seed divides in darkness. Continue how? Continue where? The circle offered no arrows, only mirrors. A new plinth rose at the ring's centre. A shallow basin of the same pale stone. Empty. The air thrummed. The room waited. Perhaps the exam was not to pick an object, but to place something of mine in the basin. Cost given freely to prove I could learn past self. I had nothing. No coin, no knife, no offerings. Only the habits I'd carried from the world outside. I set those down invisibly. The reflex to explain. The pride in understanding. The greed for mysteries over people. The basin accepted what could not be weighed, and brightened the way water brightens when moonlight remembers it. The hourglass exhaled 3 grains, which fell and vanished without sound. Somewhere out beyond the velvet dark I heard doors unlatch. The ring shuddered once like a heart consenting. The constellations of dust tightened into a single spiral above the basin, and an image formed inside that coil, so stark I took a step back. A city I knew, one I had loved in daylight and feared in storms, seen from above as if a memory had climbed a ladder. Streets, bridges, the river's long brace. Then the image blinked, and the city was gone. Not fallen, not burned, simply removed like chalk erased by a wet palm. The basin's light dimmed. The spiral hissed out. A cold wind crossed the circle, studded with silence. Who deletes a city? A god? A machine? Or the curriculum when a class refuses to learn? My stomach lurched. I thought of our legends of floods and fires, of angels and comets, of conquerors with iron names. What if those were metaphors we invented because the true verb shamed us? What if we were erased when we would not continue? The basin brightened again, faint as a candle on a grave. New glyphs surfaced at the ring's edge, and a path of light stitched itself toward a door that had not been there a breath before. A thin rectangle, darker than the dark around it, humming with the promise of a verdict. I knew the second major twist of any story is the one that makes the first look small. To step through meant letting the training ground name its author. I breathed once, steady as a stone laid on a grave to remember the weight of the gone, and did what the rooms had been asking since the first whisper on the plateau. I stepped into the circle and asked the room to show me who erases us. The darkness answered by collapsing inward, not with a roar but with the precision of a hand closing over a candle. The pale stone floor fell away, and I was suspended in an expanse without horizon, a hollow where nothing and everything met. Then slowly light bled in, not from above but from within, as if my own ribs had become windows. The first thing I saw was not a face, not a figure, but a hand. It was vast, translucent, made of lines of fire that pulsed like veins, yet it wasn't reaching for me. It was reaching toward the tapestry of earth itself, and with a sweep of fingers it brushed whole centuries aside. Civilizations, towers, walls, markets, languages, vanished as easily as chalk from slate. I wanted to scream, to beg the hand to stop, but a voice rang through the hollow before I could. This is not destruction. This is correction. The words folded into me like blades of light. My throat closed. Correction? How do you correct a city? A people? Yet the voice pressed on. The exam does not end with erasure. It begins again. The ground is reset when the lesson is refused. You are not the first. You will not be the last. My chest shivered with a deeper dread than death. The realization that human extinction may not be punishment but syllabus. We vanish, and the next class begins on the same soil, with different tools, different myths, but the same questions. Were we one more failed attempt in a sequence stretching longer than our imagination? How many times had the hand already brushed us aside? Images spun around me now, each suspended in the dark like lanterns, ruins I had studied under the guise of archaeology. A city beneath the Sahara, swallowed by sand with stones cut too precisely for its age. A drowned archipelago in the Pacific, where megaliths stand like exclamation marks. A plain in South America, scorched in spirals no storm could have carved. These weren't mysteries of erosion or disaster. They were red marks on an exam sheet. The voice softened. Erasure is not vengeance. It is the mercy of repetition. But mercy, like fire, does not wait forever. The hand drew back, and the hollow flickered. For a breath, I thought I saw figures behind the hand, tall, luminous, neither human nor entirely alien, as if light itself had chosen to walk. They did not speak, but I felt their presence like a weight on my sternum. Teachers, perhaps, or proctors, or fellow students who had graduated and now stood watch over the exam hall. I wanted to ask them why we were chosen, why Earth of all places had become the stage for this cosmic rehearsal. But before I could form the thought, the darkness cracked with images of our present. Skyscrapers, bleeding neon, oceans gasping for breath, forests stripped raw. The voice repeated sharper this time. The exam is still in progress. I staggered. Our wars, our pollution, our division. All of it was not random failure but live scoring. Every act of cruelty or mercy inked itself in real time across the sheet. The thought made me dizzy. Was every child's kindness tallied beside every tyrant's cruelty? Was every sacrifice set against every betrayal? If so, who weighs them? Who decides when the scales tip too far to allow continuation? Hand lowered once more, hovering close to me. It extended a single burning finger, and on its tip hung a tiny bead of light. The bead swayed, trembled, then split into two. One glowed gold, steady as dawn. The other flickered red, brittle as embers about to fail. The voice whispered, almost tender, "This is the choice before every age. Which flame will you keep alive?" I reached out and the bead quivered in my palm, warm and fragile. I could feel it asking me for an answer I didn't know how to give. My mind swirled with the weight of civilizations that had carried the wrong ember. Atlantis, Rome, kingdoms of dust. Had they chosen flame that burned instead of flame that endured? My breath caught. If Earth is truly a training ground, then our assignment was never to conquer it, never to own it, but to decide which fire we pass forward. The hollow dimmed. The hand, the figures, the voice all dissolved until only the bead of light remained, pulsing faintly in my palm. Then the ground reformed beneath my feet. Not stone, not tapestry, but a floor of mirrors stretching into infinity. Each reflection held me at a different age. Child, youth, wanderer, griever, elder I had not yet become. They all stared at the bead, waiting to see if I would cradle it or crush it. At the far end of the mirror hall a doorway opened, shaped like a vertical scar of light, raw and unsteady. I clutched the ember and stepped toward it, heart hammering, because now I understood the cruelest truth of this place. The city wasn't abandoned, it had been erased. The sentence dragged across my chest like a blade rinsed in snow, quick and clean, leaving the ache after. In the mirror floor, my faces waited. The child who used to sort pebbles by colour, the youth who mistook cleverness for kindness, the wanderer who believed distance could outwalk grief. All of them watched the ember in my palm as if their own futures balanced on that small, breathing light. The doorway at the end of the hall cut the dark like a scar that never learned to heal. I tried to speak, to question the room, to bargain for gentler terms. Nothing answered except the steady pulse in my hand. The gold flame warmed my skin without burning, as if it had decided to live with me rather than inside me. The red ember fluttered at the edge of sight like a moth drawn to a candle it did not understand. Choice pressed at me the way weather presses at a window. Not loud, not violent, just constant, relentless, intimate. If this world is a training ground, the cruelest tests are the ones that ask you to grade yourself. I knelt and held the ember near the mirror so I could see its light on each of my faces. The child looked convinced. The youth looked arrogant. The wanderer looked tired. What frightened me was the elder, the face I did not yet own, whose eyes were clear with a mercy I had not earned. He seemed to be waiting for me to stop performing and tell the truth. The truth is small and heavy. I have loved poorly and late. I have chosen safety when the hour asked for courage. I have listened for a voice that would excuse me from responsibility because it sounded like fate. The hall did not punish me for saying it. The reflections only softened, as if relief could be a kind of light. A memory rose, not pulled by the room, but by my shame. Years ago I sat by my father's bed the night before his lungs surrendered. He gripped my wrist and said without drama, "Don't be cruel to yourself when you learn too slowly." At the time it sounded like comfort for grief. Here, in the mirror hall, it sounded like curriculum. Perhaps the point isn't speed. Perhaps the point is direction. Continue, the chambers had told me, but continue which way? I stood and lifted the ember to eye level. Gold steadiness, dawn-coloured, patient. Inside its glow I saw small things. A door held open during rain. A soldier who cannot sleep unless he has fed the stray dog that waits by his post. A judge who pauses before sentencing because the boy's hands are shaking. None of these would save a city. All of them could save a city's chance. Then the red ember flared, catching the far mirrors with a brief seductive blaze. Inside it I saw power that moves bodies without touching hearts. Decrees, banners, victories counted like coins. How quickly we choose the flame that makes us look large. How long it takes to choose the one that makes us last. My mouth went dry. Maybe the erasures were not punishments at all, only the consequences of choosing the bright, brittle fire that devours its own future. The doorway shivered, calling. I hesitated, because stepping through felt like a vow. The hall offered no more instruction, no rubric, no voice from the ceiling. Only my faces and the ember and a scar of light that seemed to say, "We're done with telling, now we will see." I pressed the gold flame to my sternum. Heat seeped into the ache that sentence had opened, filling the wound like poured metal. I wanted absolution. The room offered responsibility. It felt both heavier and kinder than I had expected. As I walked, the mirrors kept pace, each reflection aligning for a few steps and falling behind, as if lives were beads on a thread, and I was the hand drawing them forward. I passed the youth, and did not let him lead. I passed the wanderer and accepted his restlessness, without letting it become escape. I passed the elder and allowed myself to be measured by a man I had not yet earned the right to become. The scar of light widened until it became a door, plain as stone, bright as a kept promise. I paused at the threshold, not to dramatise but to listen. Beyond the light I heard something that made my stomach sink and my heart lift at once. Voices. Human voices. Not chants, not commands. The untidy music of conversation, disagreement, forgiveness trying on its shoes. A city's murmur. Was it another exam hall, or the world itself tilted at new angle? I didn't know. Perhaps that uncertainty was the true tuition. I thought of the hand that erased, of the teachers made of light, of the rooms that had measured without malice. If they wanted us gone, they would not have built doors. If they wanted us to stay as we were, they would not have built mirrors. I curled my fingers around the steadier ember, letting its warmth choose me back, and stepped until the light reached my throat and tasted the words I was afraid to say. And then, because the only way to learn is to risk being changed by what you discover, I tightened my fingers around the steadier ember and stepped through the scar that waited to rename me. The world on the other side unfolded with the suddenness of breath after drowning. My eyes expected walls, symbols, some new chamber shaped by unseen architects, but instead I stood in a street, a city, not one of memory, not one erased and shown only in visions. It was alive, humming, layered with sound and scent and the pulse of thousands of human lives moving at once. For a moment, dizziness staggered me. Could it be that I had left the exam halls and returned to Earth itself? Or was this city another page in the curriculum, a simulation wrapped in the garments of the familiar? The stones of the street were warm underfoot. The market stalls leaned with baskets of figs and salt, with jars of wine and fabrics patterned like falling rain. The people did not look up at me. They moved past as if I were mist, or as if my arrival was too common to earn notice. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed into the current of theirs. I pressed forward, following the river of footsteps, and as I walked, recognition slowly sharpened. I knew this city. Its arches belonged to the drawings of scholars. Its courtyards were whispered about in ruins. This was not fantasy. It was cradle of the Sumerians, beating in its full pulse, unbroken by centuries of sand. My breath caught. The exam had not merely shown me lessons, it had folded me back into history. The city lived again, and I walked its arteries as though time had consented to bend. I wanted to stop, to drink the sight, to weep for the walls that once would crumble. But the ember in my chest pulsed faster, urging me on. It seemed to know there was a lesson waiting, and it would not let me linger in awe. At the centre of the city, near the ziggurat rising like a mountain carved by human hands, a gathering had formed. Priests and scribes argued in the heat, their words too quick for me to follow, but their gestures were sharp. On the ground before them lay 2 tablets of clay, wet and newly carved, one with symbols etched deep, the other left half empty. The crowd pressed in, murmuring. The ember flared. My sight sharpened. I understood, not by translation, but by meaning. They were debating what to inscribe on the second tablet. Laws, rules, the skeleton of the city's soul. Some argued for harshness, others for mercy. A voice from the throng rose, insisting that without fear there could be no order. Another countered, pleading that without compassion, order was just cruelty with polish. The air thickened. It was not simply their debate. It was mine. I had seen echoes of this question in every chamber. The balance between flame that burns fast and flame that endures. And here was wrestling with the choice that would define it. Which ember would they pass into stone? I stepped forward, though I knew none could hear me. The ember in my palm trembled, desperate to leap into their world. My throat closed. Was this the test? Not to act, but to witness the moment when humanity wrote its own exam onto clay. The scribe raised his stylus. The crowd hushed. He hovered over the blank clay, caught between voices. For an instant his eyes lifted, and though I know it was impossible, I swear they met mine. A jolt seared through me, and I felt the ember in my chest flare with a heat that scorched but did not destroy. His hand wavered, then steadied, and the stylus cut the clay. I did not know what word he wrote, but I knew with terrifying clarity that every city since had been shaped by that stroke. Our laws, our wars, our mercy and our cruelty, all traced back to the line etched in that instant. The crowd roared, half in triumph, half in fury. A city had chosen, and with that choice, its future was both secured and doomed. The ember's heat subsided, sinking deeper into my ribs. Around me the city blurred. The sound of merchants and priests stretched thin, then snapped like cloth in strong wind. Dissolved into sand and shadow, leaving me alone again in a chamber. This one was darker, quieter, its walls etched with images of cities vanishing like smoke. The voice I had almost forgotten returned, low and steady. It's one thing to lose a home. It's another to lose the memory of it. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. Perhaps the real erasure was not when walls fell, but when lessons burned with them. The room stirred with shadows that leaned forward like listeners, and as I stood among the fading echoes of the voice pressed on. Tell us, student, what will you choose to remember when the walls around you turn to dust? The question threaded through me, quiet but merciless, and the chamber seemed to lean in as if made of ears. I thought of clay tablets cooling under a sun that would one day forget their shapes. I thought of my father's hand on my wrist, the small weight of a blessing that refused to call itself a blessing. What do we keep when the world strips us? Names, banners, the pleasant edits we make to our failures, or the tiny pivots that hurt to hold because they ask us to be honest about who we were before we knew better. The floor brightened under my feet, resolving into a pale circle ringed with low alcoves. In each alcove an object waited beneath a thin skin of light, a child's stone smoothed by years of pockets, a shard of blue pottery veined with gold repairs, a broken stylus, a lock of hair bound with twine, a key to a door that no longer existed. Above the circle, the knot language spiralled and stilled, then parcelled itself into 3 syllables I could carry without breaking. Choose, keep, teach. I understood with a calm that frightened me. The chamber would let me keep 3 memories, not because it wanted the rest erased, but because the act of choosing would tell it who I was becoming. The curriculum wasn't only what had happened, it was the archive we build inside our ribs. Which recollections do we polish, and which do we let rust into silence? What does a species worship by the way it remembers? I moved to the child's stone first. It was ordinary, river-smoothed, freckled with iron. When I lifted it, an entire afternoon rose, a creek behind a house I can't find now, my knees muddy, my mother calling supper, the sun becoming a coin lost in leaves. I had ranked the stones by colour until my hands decided that smoothness mattered more than shine. It was the first time I learned that criteria can be wrong and then mended. I set the stone in the circle's centre. Keep, I thought. Keep the day I learned to change my mind for truth instead of pride. The pottery shard came next, a crescent of blue mended with gold that threaded the fracture like river light. When I touched it, I saw the bowl it once was, the meal it once held, the argument it once overheard. I remembered the year my life split, and I thought the break was the end. Later, hands kinder than mine taught me to repair with tenderness that refuses to hide the seam. The gold did not erase the crack. It honoured it. Keep, I told the chamber. Teach the way a wound can be a vein. The third alcove pulled me like tide. The broken stylus, clay still clinging to its edge. I didn't need the vision that arrived. The scribe's pause above law, the tilt of mercy into the wet tablet, to know what I was asking to carry. This memory was not about it was about the moments in my own life when I could have carved kindness into the day and chose speed instead. My throat tightened. I set the stylus beside stone and shard. "Keep the sting," I said inside, because it keeps me from becoming the kind of student who forgets the page hurts when you press too hard. The chamber darkened, then breathed. A long exhale that smelled faintly of rain on fired clay. The skin of light over the remaining alcoves hardened to glass. I reached and found them closed, not stolen but deferred, the way a book closes to protect its words from weather. Shadows rippled along the walls and arranged themselves into silhouettes. Not judges, not priests, only people, holding their own small archives. A scarf, a letter, a dented cup. "We are not towers," the room seemed to say. "We are shelves." The ember under my sternum warmed, answering. I felt a loosened knot inside my chest, and knew I had betrayed myself more often by forgetting than by failing. If Earth is a training ground, perhaps the most radical choice is to remember accurately, to refuse the comfort of triumphant edits. What civilization survives the exam if it canonizes only its victories and buries its cautions without a marker? I lifted the stone, the shard, the stylus one by one, and as I did, each left a thin thread of light that tied itself to my wrists. The threads did not bind, they steadied. The silhouettes on the wall bowed their heads in a gesture that broke me with its gentleness. Around the circle's edge, new glyphs lit. A sequence of doors, each annotated not with dates or kings, but with verbs. Share, shelter, restrain, repair, refuse, forgive. Memory as choreography. A soft patter began, distant at first, then nearer. I looked up. The ceiling had become a sky, low and swollen, and rain gathered in it without falling. I tasted it anyway, mineral and electric, the flavour of storms holding back. At the far side of the chamber a narrow doorway formed, braided of drops that never quite touched the floor. The word rose clear and old as a vow. Baptize. Not to wash away, but to bind what I had chosen to keep to what I might yet become. I stood at the threshold, the rain whispering my name the way leaves whisper rivers into believing they are sky. The ember beat once, twice. I thought of the teachers of light and the hand that corrected, of cities rewritten until their ink learned to flow gentler. If the next room would ask me to prove the memories I carried, I would have to let them weigh something in the world beyond my chest. I pressed the stone to my palm, the shard to my heart, the stylus to my throat, and with my mouth already full of sand and prayers, I stepped into the rain room to learn the cost of remembering. The first drop struck my forehead like a word etched into skin. Not wet, not cold, but weighty, as though memory itself had taken liquid form and fallen back upon me. Then another, and another, until the air thickened with rain that never reached the floor. It soaked only me, refusing to stain the stone, ignoring the silence of the chamber. The droplets carried voices, not words, but intonations, half-phrases, the rise and fall of arguments and confessions I had spoken or heard in forgotten corners of my life. I staggered under the torrent. Each drop pressed an old failure back into me, the friend I abandoned to silence because I was afraid of his grief, the stranger whose outstretched hand I pretended not to see at a train station, the apology I rehearsed but never delivered. They clung to me like wet cloth, heavy, undeniable. My knees buckled. The ember beneath my ribs dimmed, suffocated under the downpour. But then the stone in my hand warmed. I looked down. Despite the flood, it remained dry, steady, and the smoothness I had once prized as a child pulsed with quiet assurance. I understood. Remembering was not meant to drown me. It was meant to force me to decide whether memory is weight or anchor. Could I learn to use it not to sink, but to steady? I pressed the shard to my chest. The gold vein gleamed, catching the phantom rain like a net. The cracks lit up, and for a moment I saw every fracture I had ever tried to hide. Yet instead of shame, I felt release. The shard reminded me, Wounds could be luminous if we chose to honour them instead of disguising them. The rain thinned, gentled, became mist. Finally I raised the stylus to my throat. Its broken tip glimmered faintly. I spoke into the storm. We are still learning. The words came raw, shaky, but the chamber heard them. The mist receded to the edges of the room, gathering into rivers that flowed upward, defying gravity, retreating into the ceiling as if memory itself had been collected, catalogued, preserved. I gasped, trembling, drenched in silence. The floor lit with new glyphs, their spirals widening into forms unmistakably human, silhouettes kneeling, rising, passing objects from hand to hand. They glowed with verbs, not nouns. Carry, give, mend, forgive. The rain room had tested not whether I remembered, but whether I could bear memory without letting it become cruelty against myself or others. My chest ached, but lighter now, like lungs after deep breath. I thought then of my father again, his voice the night before he slipped away. Don't be cruel to yourself when you learn too slowly. The chamber had been cruel only to my illusions. Its mercy was that it let me see cruelty for what it was. Wasted time. The ember pulsed bright again, steadier than before, and this time it did not burn alone. The stone, the shard, the stylus glowed faintly, their lights weaving together like threads in the tapestry I had walked earlier. It dawned on me. These were not talismans, but tools of continuity. Lessons made portable. The training ground was not a prison, but a forge. The walls of the rain room shivered, dissolving into ripples. Beyond them I glimpsed not corridors or chambers, but landscapes. Mountains, rivers, plains, cities. Earth itself, breathing, waiting. My heart leapt. Could it be that the exam was not contained within these strange halls, but threaded into the world itself, disguised as ordinary days? The silhouettes faded, leaving only one line of glyphs across the floor. I could read them now without hesitation. The lesson is not here. It is everywhere. My breath caught. This was the cruelest twist yet, that the rooms were not teaching me anything new. They were only reminding me to see what had always been the exam. Every kindness, every cruelty, every seed eaten or planted, every hand lifted or withheld, all of it graded in silence. The mist curled once more, this time gathering into a single stream that poured toward a new doorway at the chamber's far wall. Unlike the others, this door was not made of light or stone, but of open air, framed by nothing. It led directly into night sky, stars sharp and close, as if the universe itself had stepped nearer. My knees weakened. The training ground was widening. This was no longer about chambers hidden under the skin of Earth. It was about the planet itself as classroom, and the cosmos as its teacher. I clutched the ember close, lifted the stone and shard, the stylus against my throat, and stepped forward into the night that waited, vast and unblinking, ready to test whether I had truly learned to remember without cruelty. The air outside was thin and electric, the kind of dark that listens. Wind dragged its sleeve across the grass and left a hush behind, a hush so complete I could hear my pulse counting the seconds like a small stubborn drum. I stood on open ground, no pillars, no corridors, only a long low field, with a bowl of sky tipped over it, stars crowding the rim. The rooms had dissolved into world, or the world had admitted it was the room all along. I walked until the field centre forgot the edges. The ember warmed beneath my sternum. The stone in my palm lay quiet as a moon. The shard glimmered once like a held breath, and the stylus rested along my throat as if guarding speech. I lowered my hand to the grass. It yielded not like plants, but like woven threads, remembering me as I passed. My mind kept asking the old question, if Earth is a training ground, where does the test begin and the lesson end? The night declined to answer in words. It answered in arrangement. First, a single pin of light rose from the grass, cool and deliberate. Then another, then three, until a scatter of low lights wavered around me, knee-high, lantern-quiet. They did not burn, they recognised. The lights drifted together, separating the field into lanes like a river learning to braid. I took one step and the lights corrected, faint lines knitting into a path that curved toward the north where the stars were thickest. The path felt known, and that frightened me more than strangeness. What road teaches you by pretending you chose it? A murmur started, not from speakers but from distances. Markets, oceans, 4 a.m. kitchens, temple courtyards, hospital hallways. Every human place where a decision takes its coat off and sits down. The field played them like music. Laughter trimmed of cruelty. Arguments that stopped before blood. Hands that didn't quite know how to help and helped anyway. The lights brightened at those sounds, dimmed when pride rehearsed its victory. I felt judged without being shamed, which is how you know the judge wants you to live. On the far side of the field a glimmer climbed into the sky and hung there, pearled and pale. Not a moon, not a star, a mark. The old spiral again, not carved this time, but traced in hovering light. It rotated until its mouth faced the field like a listening ear. I remembered the teachers of fire and the hand that corrected. "Who erases us?" I whispered. The stylus warmed my throat as if to remind me. Ask better. Who erases us when we refuse to continue? Who saves us when we do? The grass trembled. A seam of light opened under my feet and ran outward, dividing the field into two long halves. On my left, the low lights surged bright, arranging themselves into archways, door after door after door, all slightly ajar. On my right, the lights thinned and slowed, sinking into the soil like exhausted stars. Choice. The curriculum had shed metaphor on us plainly. Which side do you feed with your steps? I turned left. The first arch opened onto an image hovering inches above the grass. A woman refusing to mock a boy who had failed publicly. She knelt and spoke to him as if the future was listening. The second arch showed a stranger moving his body between a blow and a face. The third revealed nothing noble, only a worker resting his hand on a colleague's shoulder, so that a hard day would not make a hard person. Small doors to a large city. I passed under each, and felt the ember learn their temperatures, like a tongue learns salt. Halfway across, the sky changed. Stars gathered into a slow unfolding. A breath of light that widened and thinned until I realised I was seeing a map that was not a map. Arteries, maybe, or fault lines, or the hidden routes by which a lesson travels from one mind to another. At each intersection, a pulse flared. Some pulses were bright and steady, some sputtered, some went out. I wanted to cup the dead ones back to glow with my hands. That was when the ground answered me with motion. The field heaved like a chest catching a sob. A dark shape lifted at the centre, not stone, not metal, a structure woven of night itself. It rose without noise until it stood higher than a house and lower than a mountain, a gate made of braided light strands and human breath, wide enough for a city, shaped unmistakably like a heart. The lanes of knee-high lanterns flowed toward it, each one taking a place along its curve, each settling as if it had belonged there since before I had words. The heart gate began to beat, slow and impossible, and I felt the rhythm knock in my bones. My name came from the gate, as if spoken by every voice that had ever used it. The heartbeat quickened. Wind drew a circle around me and closed like a vow. The shard at my chest burned cool. The stone steadied my shaking hand. The stylus lifted my chin. I understood the risk then. To pass through would be to let the exam know me entirely, to allow the training, ground to grade not my intentions but my enactments. Behind me, the field exhaled a long old silence that felt like the last moment before a verdict. Before me, the heart gate opened, lit from within by a city of moving lights that spelled nothing I could read and everything I could feel. I stepped until my toes touched the threshold and the beat aligned with mine, until my breath entered the rhythm and could not find its way out, until the night pressed its forehead to mine like kin recognizing kin. And then the whole field went still, every lantern holding its breath, every star leaning nearer, as the heart of the gate brightened to a brilliance that lifted the shadows like veils and revealed figures waiting just beyond, silhouettes tall and human-shaped, carrying ember lights of their own, each flare the colour of dawn I had not yet earned. And the gate said, with a tenderness that terrified me more than any thunder, that one irrevocable word, enter. The word slid into me like a blade made of mercy, and before my body decided, my feet obeyed. I stepped through the gate of light and into the chamber of silhouettes. They did not crowd or stare. They simply stood, holding their embers the way one carries bread for the hungry. Their glow was not harsh, but steady, patient, as though it had burned long enough to lose interest in spectacle. I expected interrogation, perhaps instruction, but the figures remained silent. One stepped forward, taller than me, its ember held at heart's height. Without a word it extended the flame, and for a moment our lights touched. The sensation was unlike fire. It was like being shown the inside of another's memory without words, a transfer of understanding more intimate than breath. I staggered under it. Images not mine spilled across my vision. A tribe building a shelter in storm while their bellies starved. A lone traveller carrying a bundle of seeds across a frozen pass because he could not bear to eat them. A woman standing in front of an army with only an empty hand raised in refusal. Choices, not victories, not monuments. Choices bright enough to pass forward. When the vision faded, the figure stepped back, and another took its place. This one's ember glowed darker, almost violet. When it brushed mine, I saw lessons born of ruin. A city drowning in its own greed, its people deaf to the mercy that had been offered until too late. Yet even there, one woman placed her child into a stranger's arms, trusting love beyond blood. The ember dimmed, and I was left with the ache of both the fall and the flicker of survival. I began to understand. These weren't judges but archives, living vessels of memory, carrying forward what civilizations had chosen and failed to choose. Their embers were not awards but records. Each figure represented not an individual but an inheritance. I was standing in the library of human exams, and I was expected not to read it, but to add to it. The silence deepened. My own ember pulsed harder, warming until my ribs felt fragile, as if the bone itself might split to let light through. The stone in my hand vibrated faintly, the shard pressed harder into my chest, and the stylus along my throat demanded I speak. The figures drew closer, their embers circling mine, a constellation tightening to see if my flame would endure or falter. My throat opened. "We are still learning," I said. The words pulled from an earlier chamber, but now heavier, truer. The stylus flared, engraving the phrase into the air itself. Glyphs unfolded above me, not in alien curves, but in the alphabet I had carried since childhood, the language of my people. The words did not dissolve. They hung there, permanent. Proof that even my halting confession could be written into the record. The figures bowed their heads. It was not reverence, it was recognition. My knees buckled, not from weight, but from the mercy of being taken seriously. How many of us live entire lives unseen, unheard, dismissed even in our own memories? And here, in this impossible gate, my voice had been treated as a contribution to the exam, not a noise inside it. Then the field shifted. The silhouettes dissolved into their embers, and the embers rose like fireflies toward the sky until they joined the stars. The gate closed behind me. I was alone again, but not in silence. The air hummed, thick with memory, as if the lessons of every life were now carried in the dark around me. The ground beneath my feet quivered, then opened into another descent. I did not resist. The corridor that formed was narrower than the others, walls close, pressing me into intimacy with my own breath. Symbols crawled along the stone, some familiar, others too ancient for comfort. They depicted not civilizations, not cities, but single faces, individuals, each with a mark above the brow, flame, wave, leaf, or blade. I realised I was walking through the portraits of those who had been tested as I was. Some had passed, some had been erased. My hand brushed the carvings as if to apologise for being late to join their company. At the corridor's end a single arch waited, but unlike the others, it carried no glow, no glyphs, no hum of guidance. It was plain, bare, its stone weathered like bone. I stepped closer, heart drumming, and found faint scratches etched at eye level, crude and human. Words, carved not by the light makers but by a hand like mine. Do not forget that silence is also a choice. The ember in my chest tightened. My mouth dried. This was not a test of endurance or memory now. It was the exam of voice. Would I remain quiet, safe in observation, or would I speak even if no one answered? The arch darkened further, becoming a mouth of shadow, open and waiting. I drew a breath, held the stone tighter, pressed the shard deeper, let the stylus bite my throat, and with the silence listening like a god that pretends to be absent, I stepped into the dark, knowing my voice would be demanded, and that if I failed to give it, the training ground itself might close forever around me. The dark received me like cloth taking a crease. It was not empty, it was upholstered with waiting. I could feel it in my gums, in that soft space behind the tongue where a word rehearses before it risks the light. The air smelled of rain kept in clay and of something faintly metallic, the taste that lingers after a bitten truth. Underfoot the ground yielded like ash pressed into velvet, silent even when I dragged my heel to hear myself exist. The walls announced themselves only by temperature, cool bands grazing my shoulders as I moved. When I lifted my hand, the stylus along my throat warmed in assent. The shard at my chest steadied the ache that had grown there, and the river stone in my palm rested with the patience of a witness who refuses spectacle. My ember beat slow, as if saving oxygen for a deeper descent. Somewhere ahead a pulse answered, not heartbeat, not drum, more like a room taking breath. At last the dark blushed into sight. A low glow rose from the walls and revealed their geometry. Not flat, not smooth, but studded with shallow hollows the size of mouths. Hundreds, thousands. A choir of stone lips cupped to receive sound. Beneath each, scratches like tally marks, some neat, some frantic, some halted mid-line as if the carver had been called away by time. I remembered the corridor's warning. Silence is also a choice. Here the architecture accused kindly. How many of us have been erased by what we refuse to say? I tried the safe things first. We're still learning, I said, and the hollows warmed but did not answer. I recited a prayer taught to me by a grandmother whose hands smelled of cumin and soap. The hollows held it gently, then let it fall as if past use. I began to list historical mercies as if I could bribe the room with other people's courage. The stylus cooled against my throat. The lesson had no appetite for borrowed light. A hum gathered behind the walls, not wind, not machinery. A murmuration of nearly words, all breath and no claim. The mouths wanted something costlier than eloquence. They wanted responsibility shaped aloud. I swallowed until my throat ached and laid the river stone against my pulsing wrist like a reminder I was still a body, not only a theory. When I spoke again, my voice arrived without ornament. I have turned away when a voice broke, I said. I have chosen cleverness over kindness, because it performs better in the crowded rooms. I have confused restraint with cowardice and called it wisdom to make it hurt less. The shard at my chest burned cool, the way ice burns. The hollows brightened, not proud, not pleased, attentive, like ears that trust you to continue. I did. I said the name of a friend I let grieve alone. I said the name of a stranger whose eyes asked me for the smallest rescue, and learned what refusal tastes like. I spoke the name I reserve for myself when I have failed, the one I do not let anyone else use. With each name, a faint thread of light leapt from my mouth to one of the stone hollows and held there, trembling until a second, dimmer thread leapt out of the wall to meet it. The room stitched my admissions to the unfinished sentences of others, not absolution, not condemnation, just joining, a loom correcting a missed warp. Only then did I hear them, the almost voices of those who had stood here before me, breath on stone, syllables that never found completion. If I had, I should have, next time. They rustle like leaves that remember the tree. We weren't the first. We were a long chorus, and too many had left on the downbeat. The hollows did not mourn, they asked. A section of wall stirred. Beneath a grid of small mouths, a wider opening unfurled, lipless, a single listening held for a single sentence. The stylus flared along my throat. The ember lifted under my breastbone as if to press the words out. The ground shifted under my heels, not threatening, just reminding me that balance is earned by choosing where to place weight. I thought of the teachers of light, and of the hand that corrects. I thought of as tablet cooling as a city sealed its future into clay. The room did not want a performance, and it would not accept a plea. It wanted a vow that could be audited by days. I drew the shard against my sternum until pain sharpened the outline of my courage. I wrapped my fingers around the stone so its patience would lend me some. I bowed my head to the wide listening and let the stylus drag the sentence up from the place inside me that prefers to live unnamed. The mouths went still. The hum receded. The air leaned forward the way a river bends at a rock to hear itself change shape. So I drew breath until it hurt and spoke the one sentence the dark demanded to hear. The words left me in a tremor, stripped of ornament, too bare to retrieve. I will not withhold myself when it matters. My voice cracked on the final syllable, but the mouths didn't laugh. They flared with light so sudden it was like being inside a star at the moment of ignition. The hollows filled with brightness, each mouth over-brimming with the glow of other vows, other sentences once offered here, stitched to mine until the walls shone like constellations drawn on stone. The ground quaked, not violently but in approval, like a drum marking the end of a measure. The ember within me blazed, no longer a caged flame but a hearth. The stylus burned against my throat, then cooled, satisfied as if it had been waiting not to write poetry but to inscribe honesty. My chest ached with release, as if years of silence had been unhooked from the ribs. The vast lipless opening ahead widened, inhaling the light from the walls, swallowing every vow into its dark throat. I staggered back, thinking the chamber might collapse, but the opposite happened. The dark softened, rippled, and revealed not stone at all but sky. The horizon blinked into existence, flat and endless, a desert under the violet of pre-dawn. I stepped forward. The mouths vanished behind me, sealing shut as if they had never existed. Sand stretched in every direction, patterned with lines that looked too deliberate to be chance. They radiated outward in spirals, as though the desert had been combed by hands greater than weather. I realized the lines were words, glyphs so enormous they could only be read from above. Earth itself was a tablet, and I was walking across the strokes of a sentence too large for one pair of eyes. My shadow grew long in the rising light. For the first time, I felt exposed. The chambers had tested me in silence and shadow, in secrecy and solitude. But here, in this vast desert, the exam was public. The sand whispered with movements just beyond sight. Shapes shifted, tall, thin figures walking between the spirals, carrying objects that caught the new light. They were not the silhouettes of before. These were clearer, sharper, their forms undeniably human but stretched, as though time had pulled them longer. Their embers floated at shoulder height, steady as moons. One noticed me. It turned its elongated face, not hostile, not inviting, simply aware. It raised a hand, and in its palm burned not a flame but a shard of glass, cracked through the middle, holding light the way water holds a reflection. The gesture was unmistakable. It wanted me to see it. I raised my own shard. The figures stilled. Then, one by one, they lifted their fragments, and the desert bloomed with scattered lights, hundreds of them, thousands. I realised what I was seeing, a congregation of those who had passed the vow, not erased, not ascended, but walking still, weaving their lessons into the sand's vast script. The realisation shook me. I was not alone. The training ground was populated by graduates still learning, still writing, still choosing. The exam did not end. It only deepened. The stone in my palm pulsed with agreement. The shard at my chest aligned its crack with theirs, and the stylus whispered heat along my throat as if urging me to add my voice again. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something else. Not all figures glowed with steady light. Some carried embers so faint they looked like dust about to scatter. Some shards were shattered into dust, and where those figures walked, the sand darkened, erasing the spirals, undoing the great script. It was then I understood. Even here, choice continued. Even those who had passed could still unlearn, still fracture, still erase. The training ground was merciless in that way. No permanent laurels, no irreversible failures, only the ceaseless demand to live your vow. A figure nearest me leaned closer. Its voice was like sand struck by wind. "We are not guardians. We are reminders. Do not think you have passed." Its ember flared briefly, then steadied. "The vow begins every morning. Keep it, or lose it. There is no archive that will rescue you." The desert wind picked up, drawing the spirals into motion, dust dancing into shapes that looked like faces, some familiar, some strange. My father's eyes flickered in one swirl of sand, then vanished. A child's laughter cut through another gust, gone before I could locate it. The desert was not neutral ground. It was memory itself waiting to see if I would carry or discard it. The horizon brightened. A sun was rising, though not our sun. It was blue-white, sharp, almost surgical, washing the world in clarity too pure to hide within. The silhouettes around me tilted their faces toward it without blinking. Their embers responded, glowing brighter or dimmer depending on how much of their vow they still honoured. My ember quivered, uncertain. The tallest figure extended its cracked shard once more and pointed toward the far horizon, where the sand sloped upward into a shape too deliberate to be dune or hill. It was a stair, vast and ascending, carved into the skin of earth itself, vanishing into the blue-white blaze of the rising sun. My breath caught. The exam was not finished. The stairs promised something higher, harsher. I tightened my grip on the stone, pressed the shard deeper into my chest, let the stylus burn my throat raw. And with the vow still echoing, I turned toward the stair, knowing the next trial would not test what I had said, but whether I could live it in the unblinking light. The first riser lifted out of the desert as if summoned by my calf muscles' doubt. Sand streamed from its edges in slow veils, revealing stone the colour of old bone. The blue-white sun sharpened everything into honesty. I set my foot and felt a shiver, not from height but from recognition. The tread was worn smooth by many feet, a polished memory of ankles and hopes. I climbed. Wind braided itself through the spirals below, combing the wide script of the desert into lines that pointed here, always here. On the third step a shallow cup had been chiselled, holding a pinch of ash that refused the wind. On the seventh, a bead of blue glass lay fused into the stone. On the ninth, someone had pressed a thumbprint into wet mortar and left it to dry into a whirl of permanence. None of it felt ceremonial. It felt like what people do when they want to be remembered without insisting on glory. Higher the risers began to carry faint engravings, not the knot language, names, short ones, long ones, crooked as the hands that carved them. Etu, Nari, Sen, K-Tam, a scatter of syllables from tongues I knew, and tongues our museums guess at. I knelt by one that had been scored and rescored as if the carver feared forgetting how to spell themselves. Beside it, a line of dots counted to 20 and stopped. The 20th dot had been cut deeper than the rest. A small wound healed into shine. A thought rose, cold as the shade under a scaffold. We were not the first to find this place. The step agreed. A groove ran along its lip where offerings had been set and lifted, until devotion had become geology. Above me, figures moved along the stair's spine, their embers steady, the elongated walkers from the spiral desert becoming less alien as perspective shortened them into kin. The tallest turned, lifted a hand in greeting or warning, then faced forward again, as if the etiquette here was to let each student climb by their own breath. On the 40th step, the engravings changed, the names ended. In their place stretched rows of tiny marks, each like a seed husk split along its seam. Between the rows ran narrow grooves, river fine, collecting stray grains of sand into dark threads that tacked downward toward the desert. I brushed one groove and a vision flared, a city bright with harvest and song, then muted, then gone, not burned or drowned, but softened out of being, as if someone had exhaled and the buildings had decided to become light. "Erase," said the groove, "without cruelty." "Repeat," said the next. My stomach clenched. We weren't the first to vanish. My palms stung against the stone. The shard at my chest cooled as if to keep me from lighting grief into fire. The wind rose, and with it a low murmur, like a choir practising breath. On the 51st step a shallow bas-relief showed the great hand I had seen in the void, but up close it was not a single hand. It was many, layered, fingers overlapping, palms nested, ages upon ages of human hands pressed into one gesture. The eraser had knuckles like ours. I whispered the bitter recognition, and the stare took it from me. We are the hand that corrects. We build the tool from our refusals, and it moves because we let it. The thought didn't absolve the other presences I had felt, the teachers of light, the proctors made of hush, but it reframed them. They were not executioners, they were archivists. The mechanism of erasure was local, intimate, human. Above, the air thinned to a clean ache. The steps narrowed until my feet had to learn humility, heel to toe, heel to toe. Between risers, small niches held relics that were less relic and more proof. A sliver of obsidian dulled by use, a thread of gold twisted into loop, a shard of painted shell, a fragment of tablet inked with the faint ghost of a lore about strangers at gates. A pattern threaded them. Tools of choosing, tokens of hospitality, receipts of restraint. What a species keeps says more than what it celebrates. I climbed into the bright that forgives nothing. Questions paced beside me like lean dogs. How many times had the stairs taken this weight? How many classes had reached this height and turned back? How many had stepped forward and been translated into absence? There is a music to attrition. You hear it in the breath when someone stands at a threshold too long. At the 99th step, a lintel arced overhead. not blocking the sky but measuring it. Its underside held a single sentence, crudely carved, letters different, but meaning one. No one graduates alone. The message steadied me worse and better than a hand. Below, the desert spiral seemed to lean, listening. The elongated walkers had halted near the summit, embers held against their hearts as if warming vows. One stepped aside, making space I had not earned, and in that hospitality I felt my throat tighten with a gratitude that frightened me. The last rise arose. The blue-white sun pressed heat against my eyes until water became lens and everything haloed. Ahead, not a hall, not a temple. A door of bone-white light, narrow and tall, its seam breathing, its threshold worn by knees as much as feet. My name stirred within it the way salt stirs a wound into truth. I thought of the vow I'd offered to the choir of the mouths. I thought of the hand made of hands. I thought of cities that had slipped like chalk back into the sleeve of the teacher, and of the dot cut deeper on the 20th count. And before the light could call me, the light did call me, in a voice that braided every time my name had been spoken into one unignorable welcome, saying the words that made my heart stagger on its next beat. We have been waiting. The voice was not thunderous, not commanding, but intimate in a way that unsettled me more than if the skies had split with it. It felt as though the syllables were whispered inside my chest, bypassing ear and bone. The door of bone-white light pulsed like a lung, each breath sinking to my own, until I wasn't sure if I was breathing or being breathed. The elongated figures on the stair behind me bowed their heads, embers dimmed to reverence, and for the first time I realised this door was not for them. It was for me. I took one step closer. The seam widened. Inside the light I saw movement, shadows layered on shadows, hands outstretched not in menace but in invitation. The stylus along my throat burned with such intensity I thought it might sear flesh, but instead it released, dropping into my palm, a pen made of heat and promise. The shard at my chest quivered, aligning itself with the pulse of the light. The river stone hummed faintly, as though the patience it had carried for eons was now ready to be spent. Then the light spoke again, or perhaps it was many voices braided into one. "Do you know why you are here?" I tried to answer but found no words. The vow I had spoken echoed in my ribs, and yet the question pierced deeper. Why me? Why now? Why this stair and not another? Perhaps the real trial wasn't surviving chambers or crossing deserts, but answering that question truthfully. The door flared, and visions streamed into me, not as images but as entire histories pressing against the mind like rivers seeking mouths. Cities rising in fractals of stone and fire only to soften back into silence. Names whispered once, twice, then folded into wind. Children learning to speak, then choosing silence when speech became risk. Empires engraving laws that no hand later remembered to obey. Over and over the pattern, vow, fracture, erasure. The figures in the light stepped forward, not walking but resolving into clarity. I saw their faces, not alien, not divine, but painfully human. They bore our features, but their eyes burned with centuries. Their bodies seemed woven from memory and ash. Some smiled, some wept. Some held their palms open as if offering me the proof of their own erased lives. These were not teachers, they were remnants. The truth struck like a blade. We weren't the first to find this place, and we weren't the first to vanish. The training ground had tested countless others. Some passed, only to be called again. Some failed, dissolving into the chalk of forgotten valleys, the dust that whispered in the desert spirals. And yet, here they were, lingering in the light's archive, watching, waiting. One step closer, a woman with lines etched deep around her mouth, as though she had spoken too many vows and broken them all. Her ember flickered weakly in her chest. "You are here because it is your turn," she said, her voice like brittle paper. "Every era, the ground sends one. One to ask if the lesson has changed. One to prove if humanity has grown." Her eyes met mine, and I felt her question lance me. Had we grown? Or were we still rehearsing, still stumbling the same script? My throat tightened. The stylus pulsed hot in my palm. It wanted a sentence, but the sentence couldn't be borrowed, couldn't be inherited. It had to be mine. The desert below hushed as if listening. The elongated walkers froze mid-step, embers hovering. Even the sun's blue-white blaze dimmed slightly, waiting. The entire training ground leaned into my breath. I thought of the vow I had made in the Chamber of Mouths. I will not withhold myself when it matters. But now the question was heavier, crueler. Would I withhold humanity? Could I speak not just for myself, but for all of us? And if I failed, would the erasure fall not on me alone, but on every voice tethered to mine? I raised the stylus to my lips. The shard at my chest cracked audibly, a sound like glass surrendering to pressure. The river stone in my palm grew almost too heavy to lift, as though the weight of history itself had settled into it. My ember flared painfully as if to remind me, speak now or vanish with the rest. The woman tilted her head, her eyes burning through mine. "Say it," she urged. "Say what we could not." My lungs filled with light. My body quaked under the weight of centuries, and as the training ground leaned closer, as the door's breath held, I opened my mouth, not knowing if the words that came would redeem us or erase us forever. I did not choose poetry. I chose a sentence I could live inside without furniture. "We will be gentler than our fear," I said. "We will count a life saved as power, and we will not step back from another's fire." The syllables shook, plain and heavy. The stylus in my hand flared and etched the vow into the light as if the door were soft clay. The woman of ash closed her eyes. The other remnants did not cheer. They only listened the way debt listens to coin. The blue-white sun paused, an illusion perhaps, or consent, and the stare behind me sighed as if relieved to have heard a human voice speak without disguise. The light swelled. Threads inside it braided toward me like rivers converging, and when they touched my chest, the ember there answered with a painful brightness I could not bear alone. I staggered. Hands, many, unseen, steadied me at my shoulders and forearms, gentle as bandages, unafraid of heat. No one took the vow away. They only held my weight while I learned its centre of gravity. Again, the door breathed. Not a command, a calibration. I spoke once more, the words simpler, more expensive. I will not withhold myself when it matters, and I will not let us withhold each other. The sentence tasted like iron and rain. The stylus cooled. The river stone warmed. The shard pressed its crack against my sternum until I felt the seam align with my own. Then the light changed. What had been a wall became a lens, and through it I saw not myths, not chambers, but my world. A hospital corridor where a nurse closed a stranger's eyes. A mountain village sharing snow-muddied bread after the road broke. A courtroom where a child's stammer made a judge lower his voice. A river slick with oil, and a boy kneeling to cup one clean eddy for a sparrow collapsing in his hands. The lens quivered at every mercy, flinched at every cruelty, recorded each without sermon. The training ground was not waiting to grade us later. It was grading us live. Who decides, I asked, my voice thin in that vast brightness. Who closes the book when we fail? The lens widened. For a breath I thought I saw the great hand again, then understood what the stare had already taught. Every finger in that palm was ours. The eraser is a coalition of our refusals. When enough of us withhold, the ground resets. When enough refuse to refuse, the ground continues. The light neither condemned nor absolved me for knowing. It only brightened, as if knowledge itself were the next rung on the ladder. From the edge of the lens rose a shape like a clock without numbers. Its single hand ticked between two glyphs. One I had come to know as continue, the other a curve like a mouth closing. Between them, an interval moved. Not time, but chance. The remnant woman's ember guttered, then steadied. "This is the window," she said softly. "Every age has one. It opens, it shuts, your feet are in it." A thin dread settled under my ribs, cold and clean. I wanted to ask how wide ours was, how long before the mouth closed, how many mercies would equal a reprieve. The lens offered no arithmetic. It showed me a winter street where a neighbour filled a pot with soup and left it at a door she had sworn never to knock again. The hand of the window twitched one hair toward continue. I felt ridiculous for crying over soup in the company of beings made of memory and ash, and then I felt sane. "Is this what passes a world?" I whispered. "Soup at a door?" The ashwoman's mouth tilted, a grief smile, sometimes. Behind her, other remnants nodded, one cradling a shard of painted shell, one balancing a bowl of water that did not spill, though the light breathed harder. Power here was measured in the mass of gentleness. The lens dimmed to a bearable radiance. The door's seam narrowed, its breath growing shallow, not from impatience but because the window was not mine alone. It turned for us all. I understood then that the door would not send me back with a shining banner or a secret name. The rooms had never wanted monuments, they wanted practice. The only proof a vow is alive is the inconvenience it causes. "Will we be enough?" I asked, ashamed of the plea lodged in the question. The light did not lie. It showed me a city already halfway to erasure, edges blurring like chalk in fog, and a child on a stoop tying the laces on another child's shoe with careful fingers. A man putting down a gun because his daughter's laugh had just braided itself into his breath. A woman writing the first kind letter after years of silent war at the office door. The clock hand hopped again, small, undeniable. "Your turn," the door said, not unkindly, as the seam began to pale toward closure. "Carry, or we reset." The stair and the desert tilted toward me, as if to pour me back into my world. I clutched the stone and the stylus, felt the shard hum, felt the ember steady like a drum consenting to a long march. The remnants lifted their palms in farewell, not blessing, reminder. The light thinned to a filament I could step through, and as I braced to cross it, the training ground asked one more question with the gravity of a moon drawing tides. "Where will you begin?" The question followed me like a shadow, as the seam of light narrowed to a sliver, then folded into itself with a hush. The desert rushed upward, the stair unwinding beneath me until I stood once more at the base, my sandals sinking into spiraled sand that felt warmer, more alive, as if it too had overheard my promise. The elongated walkers dispersed into mirage, their embers scattering into faint streaks across the horizon. The sky was the same searing blue-white, but I was not. Something in me had been recalibrated, not into clarity, but into burden. Where would I begin? The training ground did not deliver instructions, no stone tablets, no carved maps. It left me with only the stylus, the riverstone, the cracked shard in my chest, and the vow I had dared to speak aloud. I turned in a slow circle. The desert stretched outward, featureless, but for the spirals that seemed to lean toward me, urging me on. Every grain shimmered like an eye waiting for an answer. The silence pressed until I could not bear it. I raised the stylus and traced a line in the air, a simple arc. The mark lingered, faint, luminous, trembling as though it doubted its own existence. Yet the desert shifted in response. A breeze pulled across the dunes, bending them in the direction of the mark. The ground was listening, but not as a servant, more as a partner who expected reciprocity. The question re-emerged, quieter now but insistent. "Where will you begin?" I thought of the lens showing me small mercies, a bowl of soup left at a door, a shoelace tied with care. Perhaps the ground was telling me the beginning wasn't a grand act, but a modest one. Perhaps every erased age had collapsed not because of wars alone, but because small mercies had thinned until the eraser's hand became unavoidable. I knelt, pressing the river stone into the sand. Immediately the spiral nearest me tightened, its lines sharpening. From its centre rose a faint shape, wavering, a face I knew, my mother's. She did not speak, but her eyes, lined with years of holding both kindness and exhaustion, pierced me. She had taught me once that beginnings often hide in the ordinary, in washing dishes, in listening without planning a reply. The vision dissolved, but the weight of her gaze remained. I understood, though I resisted it. The training ground was not asking me to begin here, in the desert. It was sending me back into the weave of the world I thought I had left behind. My test would not be fought in chambers of mouths or stairs of names. It would unfold in hospitals, in courtrooms, in streets where strangers passed each other without meeting eyes. I was not chosen to escape humanity. I was chosen to return to it. The shard in my chest vibrated, aligning with my heartbeat. The crack within it glowed faintly, not a wound anymore, but a seam of light, like a scar that refuses to stay silent. The ember steadied, its rhythm syncing with the faint hum of the desert. I knew then my vow was now a contract written in my flesh. If I broke it, the erasure would not need to come from above. It would begin inside me. I stood, sand cascading from my robes, and faced the horizon. The spirals thinned, giving way to an edge I had not seen before, a shimmer where desert met air, a threshold back into the familiar world. The silhouettes of cities and rivers flickered there, as though the training ground had painted a door and waited for me to step through. The question pressed one final time, louder, firmer. Where will you begin? I breathed in the hot wind, tasting salt and ash, tasting all the remnants who had walked this ground before me. And with a steadiness I did not entirely believe, I whispered my reply. I will begin where it is easiest to turn away. The threshold quivered, widening. The spirals behind me loosened into waves, sighing as if their task was complete. Light bled into the desert, not harsh but golden, warm as evening hearth fire. I clutched the stylus, the river stone, pressed my hand against the shard in my chest, and stepped forward into the shimmer. The ground beneath me softened, the air thickened. A city's noise stirred faintly, cars and voices, the pulse of ordinary life. I felt the training ground retreat behind me, its silence folding like a book closed but not forgotten. The vow thrummed inside me, insistent, a second heartbeat I could never quiet. And then, with a rush of air like a lung inhaling, I was home. The world of bills and laughter and grudges and small mercies enveloped me, unknowing of where I had been. The test had not ended. It had only just begun. The city greeted me with the ordinary clatter that hides so much. Heels on pavement, an argument sifted to whispers at a crosswalk, the ache of a violin leaking from an open window. My vow vibrated like a second pulse under the skin, small and insistent. I felt the shard in my chest take its place along my sternum like a compass needle settling. The river stone warmed my palm with the patient heat of sunlit pockets. The stylus rested at my throat, a quiet weight that refused to be jewellery. If earth is a training ground, then the streets are its corridors and every door is a proctor. I began where it's easiest to turn away, the stairwell. 2 floors below, a neighbour's voice had become a hard, looping tide. A child's cry came in tight, gulping bursts. I stood on the landing, the old reflex rising. This is not my business. Keep your head down. Climb. The stylus burned. My vow pushed. I knocked with the river stone, not loudly, but like you touch someone's shoulder when they're sleepwalking toward a cliff. The door opened a fraction. a tired face, a hand still curled from shouting. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice softer than I meant. The face sagged, the muscles around the eyes learning a new shape. "Maybe," came the answer. No pride wants to speak. I stood in the doorway with nothing but listening, and somehow a kettle hissed, and a chair was pulled out, and the child crawled into the light like a dawn that had been hiding behind weather. What changed? Nothing loud. Everything. On the street a man stumbled, cursing at ghosts. The crowd parted around him like water avoids a rock. I felt myself about to flow with them. The shard cooled, displeased. I stepped into his path and offered the river stone as if it were a fairy token. He blinked, not at the stone, at me, the first face that saw him as interruptible by kindness. He took it, laughed once, hard and broken, and handed it back with a nod that felt like two human beings telling each other they still exist. How many rescues are only the courtesy of acknowledgement? I tested my vow again in a waiting room where the clock had fallen into the habit of moving too slowly. A woman pressed both hands over her mouth as a doctor spoke without looking up. I sat beside her. No words. The stylus warmed when I did not reach for explanation, cooled when I let the silence be shelter instead of sentence. Outside, rain rehearsed on the windows. I remembered the rain room and the way memory can drown or baptize. "I'm here," I said, and meant it. Sometimes the exam asks only that you fail to abandon. But the city had teeth. At dusk, two boys squared off in the park, Rage wearing Bravado's jacket. A circle formed the way mouths form around spectacle. I stepped into the ring, heart pounding, calling both by names they did not know I knew. Their surprise loosened the fight's hinge. One laughed, embarrassed. The other tried to save face with a curse that wilted as he said it. When they parted, the crowd groaned, starved of blood. My legs shook. The stylus at my throat cooled like metal after a brand is lifted. Who counts these moments? The light does. The ground does. Perhaps that is enough. Nights blurred. I learned which corners needed soup and which needed restraint. I called my mother and didn't rush her stories. I wrote a letter I had avoided for years and folded my pride inside it like a note you finally slip beneath a door in the dark. Some mornings my ember beat high, others it guttered, and I failed. I looked away from a stranger's wet eyes on a train. I let sarcasm win a small argument it did not deserve to enter. On those days the edges of buildings went soft, as if erased a finger's width by fog. I understood the threat. The eraser is built locally, brick by refusal. Did the city blur because of me? The question cut, and that cut kept me tender. Every so often, wind threaded the avenues with a scent of cold stone and old rain, and I knew the training ground was checking my work. I would feel that unseen metronome tap my ribs, continue. When I kept the vow, streetlights brightened a shade warmer. Or maybe it was only my body lowering its guard enough to notice gentleness where it had always lived. When I failed, the stylus pinched. Calibration, not punishment. Still, the clock without numbers in my memory nudged its single hand. How wide was our window? What exactly would shove it shut? One evening I turned a corner and saw a house I knew too well. An upstairs lamp burned steady as if practicing courage. In the window, the silhouette of the friend I had abandoned to his grief. The sidewalk under my shoes felt like a corridor that had finally opened after years of being bricked up. I stood at the gate and tasted metal and river on my tongue. If I could not keep the vow here, in the first place I had learned to fail. What weight did any other lesson carry? The stylus grew hot, then still. The shard in my chest hummed like a seam of ore struck by a careful pick. The river stone warmed until it was not a stone but a kept promise. I lifted my hand. The sky, undecided between blue and black, held its breath with me. The training ground leaned in like a teacher pretending to study the ceiling while listening for the answer. I lifted my hand and knocked once, twice, and the door opened on the next lesson. The air inside was thick with memory. Not the kind you consciously summon, but the kind that clings to fabric, that waits in wood grain until the right sound calls it forth. My friend stood framed in the doorway, older now, his eyes carrying new shadows. He didn't speak at first, neither did I. We simply stared, as though time itself was trying to decide if it would permit this reunion. The shard in my chest throbbed. The stylus grew heavy, and the riverstone hummed faintly, as if reminding me that this was not just a personal visit, but a test folded within a test. My vow reverberated. I will not withhold myself when it matters, and here it mattered more than anywhere else. "Why now?" he asked finally, his voice sandpapered with nights I had not been there to soften. I swallowed. Words felt like dry seeds in my throat. "Because I should have been here before. Because I chose silence when I should have chosen you." His face shifted, not to forgiveness yet, but to recognition. Sometimes the most healing thing is not an apology's perfection, but its nakedness. He let me in. The room smelled of books, of dust, and faintly of despair that had not yet aired out. We sat. The silence between us was jagged, but I did not rush to sand it down. The stylus pulsed warmly when I held the silence without fear, cooled when I wanted to fill it with excuses. He spoke first. A story tumbled out. His father's death, his own nights staring at ceilings, the betrayal of friends who left when grief became inconvenient, and finally, my name, spat once in bitterness. The sound landed in the room like a stone tossed into still water, and the ripples reached both of us. "I deserved that," I said quietly, "and worse." His eyes searched me. Perhaps he expected me to defend myself, to rationalise, but my vow pressed against my ribs like a stern teacher's gaze. I had to stay in the raw truth of it. I had failed him. There was no training ground without acknowledging where I had already collapsed, and yet something subtle shifted. The ember in my chest steadied, its glow spreading outward, faint but sure. My friend leaned back, his shoulders dropping. He wasn't absolving me. He was simply no longer carrying me as a weight he had to curse to survive. We spoke until the lamp guttered. The riverstone warmed in my palm as if approving each small bridge laid across the gulf. At one point he laughed, short, bitter, but unmistakably laughter. And in that moment I felt the air stir, as though the training ground itself had opened an invisible window to let the dust escape. When I left his house, the city looked subtly different. Streetlights glowed softer, shadows didn't cling so tightly to corners. Or perhaps it was only me who had shifted, my eyes recalibrated by the act of refusing to turn away. But then I noticed something undeniable. On the pavement, faint spirals of chalk traced themselves where my feet had lingered longest. The mark of the desert, the handwriting of the ground itself. It was watching still. The question returned, fiercer this time. Where else have you withheld yourself? The stylus quivered against my throat. The shard in my chest cracked further. Not painfully, but like a shell opening to release a hidden light. The test was not just about strangers or neighbours. It was about the unvisited rooms of my own history, the fractures I had chosen to step around. Sleep did not come easily that night. Dreams pressed against me, heavy with faces. Some I had wronged by absence, others by silence, others still by pride disguised as wisdom. They waited in the dream corridor like the elongated walkers on the stair, each carrying embers dim or bright. They did not accuse. They only stood, reminding me that vows are never theoretical. When dawn came, I rose with a clarity that frightened me. The training ground was not merely asking me to tend the world outside. It was demanding that I descend into my own abandoned corridors and bring light there too. If I could not bear the weight of my own withheld mercies, how could I carry the mercies of others? I stepped into the street, the city already humming awake. I felt the stylus warm, guiding me not to the busy boulevards but to an old part of town, a neighbourhood I had avoided for years. My feet moved as if magnetised. With every step, spirals shimmered faintly beneath me, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The vow was leading me deeper, to a place where my own erasures had begun. And as I turned the corner, I saw the building that had waited for me like a wound left unstitched, its windows dark, its doorway yawning. The training ground was not behind me. It had followed me here. The building hunched on the corner like a memory that had learned to wear brick, its windows clouded with old breath. I knew the cracked tile of the foyer before my feet reached it. I knew the hum of fluorescent lights that refused to die. This was where a corridor in me had been walled off, the place I had watched and not spoken, the day a boy's soft voice was broken in public and I helped break it by staying quiet. Dust lifted in slow ecclesiastical swirls as I crossed the threshold. The stylus warmed at my throat, not to write but to warn. The river stone in my palm took on the weight of a key. The shard along my sternum pulsed once, twice, as if remembering its own fracture. Somewhere above, a pipe clicked like a metronome marking the seconds before a confession. Who builds a sanctuary out of shame and then refuses to pray in it? A bulletin board sagged along the hall, its thumbtacks holding sun-faded notices that once mattered terribly to someone. Faces in photographs watched me pass. A team with grass-stained knees, a choir mid-note, a science fair winner holding a volcano that looked ready to erupt. Some faces were sharp, others blurred as if fog had taken a personal interest. When I let my eyes slide away, the blurring spread. When I named the day, the boy's name, my silence, the faces sharpened again. Did the eraser work this delicately, grain by grain, until only edited history remained? The old classroom door stuck, then gave. Inside, rows of desks sat like small boats abandoned at low tide. On the blackboard, chalk dust haloed a single sentence that hadn't been there when I was young. Do not forget that silence is also a choice. My chest tightened so fast I had to sit. The stylus burned, cooled. I remembered the boys' hands, how they tried to learn invisibility. I remembered how the room laughed because laughter is the easiest mask fear can find. I placed the river stone on the teacher's desk the way you place a lantern at a grave. The air changed. The chalk marks flocked together into a spiral I knew from deserts and thresholds, brightening until the board looked like a slow galaxy unfolding. The training ground had not recreated the room. It had revealed the room's true shape. Every classroom is a gate if someone dares to open their mouth. Who was I if I kept choosing doors I refused to enter? Footsteps rang in the corridor. Rubber soles, quick, uncertain. A meeting, I remembered. The neighbourhood council used this building now. Arguments staged in the same space where we once rehearsed our futures. Voices rose, clipped and brittle, gathering like storm fronts. I should leave, said the part of me that still protects comfort like a shrine. Continue, said the rooms I had walked. The shard pulsed, aligning its seam with the ache that sentence always opened in me. I climbed. The stairwell smelled of pine cleaner and wet coats. On the landing, a woman paced with a stack of petitions, her jaw clenched against exhaustion. In the room beyond, 3 men argued about a shelter proposed for the block. Economics wore morality like a borrowed jacket. The vote would be close, the air already erasing the faces it pretended to represent. I reached the doorway and hesitated. How many times had I excused myself by claiming I lacked expertise, as if compassion required credentialing? I stepped in. Heads turned with the polite annoyance reserved for interruptions that threatened to become necessary. The chair asked if I had business. My voice arrived before my courage. I live 2 streets over, I said, and I withheld myself when it mattered in this building once. I'm trying not to do that anymore. The room did not swoon. The petition papers did not burst into flame of approval. A man in the back smirked. The woman with the petitions lowered her shoulders a fraction, as if released from holding the ceiling up alone. I spoke plainly, not long. I told them about a hallway, a laugh, a boy who learned to fear his own name. I told them about rooms that measure us without malice, and about a clock that turns between continue and closure. I said we could be graded on soup left at doors, on hands that put down what they are licensed to carry, on shelters that show a city it has not forgotten how to be a body. Questions followed, some sharp, some sincere. The vote pushed, paused, bent, broke, bent again. Who counts the moment a room learns a different verb? When it ended, the motion passed by one. No trumpet, no miracle. Only a breath the building seemed to hold and then release. I walked back into the hallway on unsteady legs. On the tile, faint chalk spirals glimmered and vanished, as if the desert had written thank you in a language of dust. Outside, rain began in a cautious script on the pavement. The vow inside me steadied like a lamp, learning the room it is meant to light. I descended the steps, and at the bottom the night parted to reveal a narrow alley I had never noticed. A seam of dark that seemed to breathe like a door, and I knew the training ground wanted me to follow it. The alley was thinner than any street should have been, squeezed like a vein between two brick ribs of the city. It exhaled a cold that didn't belong to weather. My first instinct was retreat, yet the stylus at my throat warmed insistently, urging me forward. I pressed my hand against the brick, half expecting it to reject me. Instead, the wall seemed to soften, the mortar grains humming faintly, as though the city's bones recognized me. I walked. The alley swallowed sound so that each footstep landed without echo. Windows high above were bricked shut, blind eyes refusing witness. The air thickened, and then I saw them, faint etchings along the walls, spirals nested within spirals, glowing in pulses like veins under skin. They weren't graffiti. They were instructions written in the ground's own hand, a reminder that thresholds don't always look like doors. As I moved deeper, memories stirred, not mine alone, but inherited ones. Whispers of others who had walked here before, voices faint as chalk dust. We were called. We entered. We carried what we could not yet name. Their presences brushed against me, half invitation, half warning. Had they passed the test? Or had they failed and become echoes in the mortar? The alley narrowed until it barely admitted my shoulders. I turned sideways, heart hammering, breath rasping like a blade against stone. The shard in my chest glowed, flooding my ribs with heat as though preparing to crack open entirely. My vow pulsed in rhythm with it. I will not withhold myself when it matters. But here the question sharpened. What if the thing withheld was not silence but fear itself? Could I surrender even that? The brick suddenly yielded into a courtyard, a hollow heart hidden inside the city. At its centre stood a pool no larger than a fountain basin, though no water fed it. Instead, its surface shimmered with shifting reflections, faces, places, moments I had buried. My friend's eyes on the night I abandoned him, the boy in the classroom, my own face, the first time I chose comfort over truth. The images wavered and reformed, each one demanding not denial but recognition. I knelt by the pool. The stylus lifted itself from my throat and hovered over the surface like a pen waiting for a signature. The river stone in my palm dissolved into light, sinking into the reflections as though feeding them. And then I heard the voice, not external, not internal, but threaded through both. If Earth is a training ground, this is its mirror. Can you bear to face the lessons without flinching? I touched the water. It did not ripple. Instead, it clung to my fingers like a second skin, drawing me in. The images deepened. I saw myself walking through the desert spiral, through the tower of echoes, through every corridor where faces blurred because of my absence. And then something stranger. I saw others walking parallel paths, unknown people bearing similar shards, their vows glowing in their chests. Humanity, scattered but tethered, all walking alleys they believed were theirs alone. The pool whispered another question, sharper than the first. What if the training ground is not about surviving Earth, but about surviving each other? My stomach clenched. The vow expanded inside me until it pressed against bone, threatening to break me open entirely. Was this the third twist the training ground had been waiting for? That the test was not individual at all, but collective? The air in the courtyard grew heavier. The spirals etched into the walls began to move, rearranging themselves into larger patterns. The ground itself vibrated beneath me, not violently, but with the insistence of a heartbeat larger than any single chest could hold. It was the Earth's pulse, steady, ancient, patient. And I realised with a shiver that it had been listening to every silence, every withheld act, every unspoken truth. Nothing had been wasted. Nothing had been forgotten. I rose to my feet, dripping light from my hands instead of water. The courtyard had become brighter, though no sun touched it. The stylus returned to my throat, heavier now, as though the next words it demanded would be harder than any spoken before. The shard in my chest split wider, light spilling through my ribs like dawn through a ruined temple. And the alley behind me had sealed shut. There would be no turning back. The training ground had cornered me in the one place I could not escape, myself, multiplied by the weight of all humanity. And as I turned back to the pool, the reflection shifted again. Not past failures now, but a future I could barely recognise. One in which the test did not wait for me alone, but for all of us. A horizon trembling with both promise and threat. The courtyard's hush deepened until it felt like cloth laid over a body. The water steadied and opened like an eye. Within it, streets braided themselves into arteries of light, and along those arteries moved people carrying the small radiances of their vows. A woman setting. A table for a neighbour she had only ever waved to. A boy stepping between jeers and the child they were meant to wound. A judge lowering his voice. A worker refusing to laugh at a cruel joke that wanted to be law. Where such acts gathered, city blocks brightened as if dawn had decided to try a new address. Where people withheld, colour thinned to the chalk sickness I had seen in the erasing halls. The shard in my chest drew warm lines through my ribs. The stylus at my throat trembled like a tuning fork, as if the future were a note seeking the pitch of our courage. My riverstone was gone, dissolved into the mirror, yet in my palm lay its imprint, an absence shaped exactly like a tool. Perhaps that is how responsibility always returns to us, as the weight we thought we set down. The pool offered more. I saw hands passing bowls through a fence while cameras pretended bones were borders, saw a woman unsign a contract that would have paid her to forget how to be kind, saw a street where every window opened during a blackout and the night filled with candles like a constellated oath. The image trembled, split, and the same streets returned with different choices. Doors shut, soup withheld, laughter sealed into private rooms. The brightness dulled. The clock without numbers hovered over the water, its single hand quivering between continue and closure. We were the pressure on that hand, and I felt the dread and privilege of it open like weather inside my chest. I thought of the teachers of light, and the hand built of hands. How many times had this pool shown a student the same two films of the future, and asked which reel we would feed with our days? A tenderness found me then, the kind that hurts because it refuses to lie. We were not wicked beyond repair. We were simply late to our own lesson. The ground wasn't punishing us. It was pleading with us to stop grading ourselves on triumph and start grading ourselves on care. The water thickened, darkened, and a different vista rose. Wilderness, not city. Forests unscrolling their ancient script, rivers cutting syllables into stone. In the canopy, small lights moved from branch to branch, but they were not our embers. They belonged to the living world itself, to the elder classrooms that had tolerated us as apprentices who keep dropping their tools. I felt shame burn gently. We had been students convinced that the school existed for us. The shard's seam pulsed once, and I understood that Earth was not only our teacher, it was also taking an exam written in our footsteps. "Then what does begin mean?" I asked the courtyard, my voice small. The pool responded with intimacy that stunned me. My mother's kitchen, steam haloing the pot. My father's last night, when mercy meant sitting still. My friend's doorway, where apology did not fix but fed. The training ground had never wanted grand gestures. It wanted sustained ones. It wanted the arithmetic of daily rescue. A final sequence, rows, a meeting of strangers in an ordinary room, paper cups, cheap chairs, hands shaking as if they were learning a new alphabet. No banners, no slogans, only a ledger of what each would do tomorrow. Call, carry, refuse, repair. As they spoke, I realised I knew some of their faces from the dream corridors and the city's periphery. The nurse, the neighbour, the boy with the shoelace. The pool did not show me a saviour. It showed me a quorum. The air cooled as if a cloud had passed across the invisible sun. The spirals etched on the walls stilled. The alley beyond the courtyard remembered its breath. The clock hand flicked, half a hair toward continue, and held there, shivering. I understood the peril. No single vow could anchor it. But 1,000 could nudge it. 10,000 could carry it like a keel. I leaned over the pool until my breath freckled its skin. "We will be gentler than our fear," I whispered, and felt the words pass through the water into the street plan of futures like warmth through glass. For a moment the city brightened with the soft decisiveness of morning. For a moment I believed. Then the image buckled, as if struck by a wind from below, and the brightness shrank, and a shadow rose, not hand, not storm, but a pattern I recognised too late. Across ruins and thresholds, across the long stair and the mouth of light, I had mistaken their scattered signs for riddles to be solved, puzzles for cleverness. The pool smoothed itself to a mirror and drew a line so stark my heart went still. I understood then that the ones before us had not left treasure maps or riddles to reward the bright. They had left hazard tape in a language we kept misreading. I leaned closer as the pool cleared to show what they had really left us. Not clues, but warnings. The surface rippled once, and the images deepened until I felt I was no longer leaning above the water but falling into it. Warnings, yes, but of what? The city dissolved, and in its place rose towers of salt collapsing into seas, forests with their roots burned black, skies torn open by winds that bent metal like reed. These were not prophecies of a distant millennium. They were rehearsals already staged in the world outside this hidden courtyard. A glacier splitting, an ocean rising, a season arriving in the wrong month. Each one was an underlined passage in the lesson plan we had failed to read. And yet, amid these devastations, the images carried something sharper than ruin. Repetition. The disasters were not singular events, but loops. Collapse, rebuild, forget. Collapse, rebuild, forget. The training ground did not test us with novelty, but with recurrence, circling back like a teacher who asks the same question in a quieter voice until the student stops pretending not to hear. The shard in my chest throbbed with a rhythm almost unbearable. The stylus against my skin seared until I could not tell if it marked me from without or within. A thought seized me with the certainty of a blow. Maybe Earth was not a place preparing us for some future beyond itself. Maybe it was the exam itself, the last desk we would ever sit at, and our task was not to graduate, but to finally understand the test paper already placed before us. I saw then why the elders had spoken of practice, of drills, of gates and looms. They did not mean rehearsal for another world. They meant rehearsal for this one, endlessly returned to us, until we no longer sabotaged it. But the warning lay not only in repetition. The pool trembled again, and I saw civilizations that had come before. Faces blurred, languages stripped of sound, yet their gestures unmistakable. Building, warring, kneeling, forgetting. Their warnings had not been curses but notes slid under the door of history. And we, distracted students, had left them unread. The courtyard spirals glowed once more. Not softly now, but with a fevered urgency. The ravens in the trees above screamed as if echoing the alarm. The pool showed fire licking the edges of maps, and then, almost tenderly, it showed what still stood unbroken. A hand passing bread, a mouth refusing a lie, a child turning toward another child instead of away. Small, almost invisible choices. Yet the clock hand hovering above the pool bent a fraction toward continuance when those images rose, and toward erasure when they dimmed. Warnings. They had left warnings because they knew brilliance without mercy always devours itself. They had seen themselves undone not by ignorance of stars or metals, but by neglect of each other. And they had learned too late that a training ground does not grant infinite retakes. The walls of this test close in if the lesson is not learned. I could not move for a long moment, as if the weight of all past apprentices pressed its knees into my shoulders. When at last I lifted my eyes, the alley beyond the courtyard no longer looked like stone and shadow, but like a passageway out of a burning library. I wanted to carry at least one sentence intact, one truth unscorched. The pool dimmed until it was no more than water again, my own reflection staring back with fever-bright eyes. The stylus slipped from my throat into my hand, its tip gleaming like a coal. The shard in my chest quieted, but I knew it was not sleep. It was waiting for my next decision, for all our next decisions. The courtyard exhaled as if it had spent its last reserve of patience on this revelation. A hush spread outward like the radius of a struck bell. I stepped back from the pool, the image of those warnings still carved across my vision, and I understood the next move was no longer in their hands nor in the hands of the ground. It was in ours. The air trembled as if listening for my step. The alley called like an unfinished sentence. I knew there would be no map, no escort, no final explanation, only the warnings and the will to heed them. So I turned toward the narrowing street, and with the stylus burning in my palm, I walked on, carrying with me the question that refused to loosen its teeth. What if we were already on our last attempt at this lesson? The words followed me out of the alley like a stray dog that had decided my weakness was worth adopting. The city received me without ceremony. Neon fretted in puddles. A bus sighed, doors opening like lungs too tired to protest another round. Somewhere a couple argued in low voices, careful not to wake a sleeping child. The night had the smell of rain cooling a feverish street. I felt the stylus at my throat like a borrowed conscience, the shard warm against my sternum, the ember steadying to a workman's pulse. If we are on our last attempt, then this is not the hour for cleverness. It is the hour for humility that can lift weight. I thought of the pool's warnings, of salt towers collapsing, of seasons arriving with the wrong names. I thought of cities smudging at the edges like chalk when a careless hand leans too hard. But the images that held me were smaller, obstinate in their tenderness. The shoelace tied, the soup left, the gun put down. The clock without numbers had flinched toward a continue at those. The hand that erases had our fingerprints, so would the hand that stays it. I walked without choosing where, legs remembering routes I had avoided, and found myself at the river. It ran black and sure beneath the bridge, railing cold against my forearms. The water kept its counsel. I heard my father's sentence again. Don't be cruel to yourself when you learn too slowly. and tried to hear the second half he never said aloud, but do not stop learning. The shard in my chest pulsed to that cadence. Maybe the curriculum is merciless only to what refuses to grow. On the far bank, a woman lifted a window and shook a rug into the dark. Dust turned to glitter for a second and vanished. She stood there a while, hands on the sill, and I knew nothing about her except that she had paused long enough to listen to the air. It felt like a sign not for portent but for practice. This is the rhythm we must learn, attention opening like windows in a row. I wanted to believe that if enough of us leaned out, the street would fill with something more breathable than habit. I crossed the bridge and passed a corner where men dealt in quick exchanges, their bodies tense with purchase and survival. One met my eyes and looked away, then back, startled that I had not armoured my face. My vow tugged. I did not play saviour. I offered a name, mine, ordinary as a coat. He didn't give his. He nodded once, almost offended by the gentleness, then softened into it like a muscle unclenching. The moment was nothing, and it tilted the world by a degree you could only measure if you believed in drift. There were failures too. A cyclist swerved and cursed, and my anger rose hot and clean. I let it crest and spit a word I would have preferred to store. The buildings blurred a finger's width. The stylus cooled in disappointment. I stood still until the blur withdrew, then whispered an apology no one heard, except that maybe the ground did, because the streetlight above me warmed a tone from clinical to human. Calibration. Again and again. Until instinct learns to arrive as kindness without rehearsal. I kept moving. A staircase asked for knees. A pawnshop window asked for mercy. A sleeping dog asked for silence. In each choice, the ember weighed me and found me a little lighter, or a little heavier. By the time I reached the plaza, dawn had salted the edge of the roofs. A municipal worker swept cigarette butts into a neat drift. He looked at the heap the way a monk looks at prayer, resigned and faithful. I helped him with the last few, and neither of us mentioned it because some cooperations are shy. A busker began to tune a guitar, strings complaining. He played a single chord, then another, then a third that didn't belong but apologised its way in so well the song welcomed it. The plaza took a breath. I saw us then not as heroes but as notes, blunt or sweet, learning to make a chord we could stand to live inside. The warnings the predecessors left were not threats from above. They were sheet music from those who had practised until their hands shook and still dropped the pick. They had written, "Try again, but together this time." The sun lifted its coin through the cloud bank. In that new light, the spirals I had seen in deserts and classrooms teased the edges of the paving stones, bright as if someone had drawn them with a wet finger. I followed them with my eyes until they led to a row of doors just opening on the day. A clinic, a school, a shelter with bad coffee and good news, a bakery whose first loaves made the air into a reason to forgive. My breath evened. If this is our last attempt, perhaps it is also our first to be honest about the exam. We win it by making sure more of us can sit for it tomorrow. I stood at the centre of the plaza with the stylus at my throat, and the shard warm and the ember steady, and I looked up, not for omens, but to steady my voice against a sky that had heard too many elegant abdications, and so I lifted my head and asked the night the questions that remained. The plaza had grown quieter, as if the dawn itself leaned closer, waiting for the words I'd not yet found. They were not incantations, not spells, not even the pleas of one desperate voice. They were the trembling syllables of a creature aware it might be learning too late. If Earth is a training ground, then the true test was never about conquest, nor dominion, nor pride. It was about whether we could kneel low enough to hear what the ground, the rivers, the skies, and each other had been saying since the first spark was coaxed into flame. Do not waste this chance. I remembered the fragments of spirals carved into stone, the lessons smuggled through collapse, the maps without numbers. All of it pointed toward a single task. Not to escape this classroom, but to inhabit it without cruelty. To see deserts as pages, oceans as breath, forests as lungs, one another as mirrors. We had been tested through storms and famine, through plague and war, through silence and wonder, and still the question had not changed. Would we grow? The shard at my chest no longer pulsed in warning. It steadied, warm as a heartbeat one could lean against. Perhaps the examiners had stepped back, letting us grade ourselves. Perhaps they had always been no further away than the next kind act, the next withheld cruelty. Perhaps the legends of gods and watchers were only metaphors for the quiet tally kept by the earth itself. I thought then of all the hands, ancient, forgotten, anonymous, that had passed this stylus down, each hoping the next would write a gentler chapter. The sun climbed, indifferent to whether we passed or failed, casting the same light on cruelty and compassion alike. But I chose to believe that indifference was not abandonment, but fairness. No divine correction, no sudden rescue, only the freedom to answer in our own script. That, I realised, was the harshest mercy of all. And so, I stood there with questions louder than any conclusion. If Earth truly is a training ground, who sets the lessons, and have we misunderstood them from the start? If we are tested not by brilliance but by kindness, how many chances remain before the classroom closes its doors? Could it be that the ones we call predecessors are not gone at all, but waiting to see if we'll finally learn what they could not? And if so, what will we leave for the next hands that take up this stylus? Warnings or wisdom? Share your thoughts below, and if you're new here, subscribe to Planet Echoes so you don't miss the next mystery in the world's hidden history.